Montana Territory, 1875. The mountain air carried a bitter chill as the first snow of winter dusted the rolling hills of Whitehorn Valley. Reid Hastings pulled his worn leather gloves tighter and squinted at the western horizon, gauging how much daylight remained. Not nearly enough. Cattle rustlers had struck 3 ranches in the county this month, and the threat hung in the valley like the scent of smoke. He would need to finish his rounds before darkness gave cover to desperate men. At 26, Reid carried responsibilities that aged a man beyond his years. His weathered hat and sun-baked skin contrasted with clear blue eyes that still held youth, though they rarely sparkled with it anymore. 6 years as foreman of the Rocking H Ranch had hardened him in ways that belied his handsome features. The clean lines of his jaw stayed mostly smooth. He took the time to shave regularly, one of the few concessions to civilized life he maintained. But it was his daughter who gave meaning to his existence. 8-year-old Lily had her mother's golden curls and quick smile, gifts from a woman Reid had loved and lost to childbed fever. That day had taught Reid everything he needed to know about life. Loving too deeply was a risk no prudent man would take twice. "Pa," Lily called, her voice carrying across the yard as Reid dismounted. "Miss Katherine is here with new books." Reid concealed his frown. The schoolteacher's twice-monthly visits had become a fixture in their routine, but Reid maintained a careful distance. Katherine Zimmer represented everything complicated about civilization creeping into the territory: education, refinement, and the uncomfortable reminder that his daughter needed a woman's influence. "Be right there," he called back, leading his horse toward the barn. He took his time with the grooming, delaying the inevitable social niceties. Miss Zimmer was undeniably beautiful at 22, with chestnut hair that caught golden highlights when she moved through sunbeams, and a warm smile that had half the unmarried men in town fabricating reasons to visit the schoolhouse. Her dresses, modest but made with obvious care, always seemed to be shades of blue or green that matched the landscape. Today, when Reid finally entered his cabin, she wore a deep forest green that made her hazel eyes appear more vibrant. "Mr. Hastings," she greeted him with that schoolteacher formality that kept everyone at arm's length. "I hope you do not mind my bringing additional reading materials. Lily has progressed remarkably." "Appreciate you making the journey, Miss Zimmer," Reid replied, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Especially with winter coming on." "Education waits for no season, Mr. Hastings." The cabin was warm, filled with the aroma of the stew Reid had started that morning. Lily sat at the table, already entranced by an illustrated book of natural wonders. Her small finger traced across images of far-off places neither of them would likely ever see. "Pa, Miss Zimmer says there are mountains bigger than ours, with snow that never melts even in summer." "Is that so?" Reid's eyes met Katherine's briefly before he busied himself stoking the fire. "The Himalayas," Katherine confirmed, "though I confess I have only read about them myself." "Will we see them someday, Pa?" Reid smiled despite himself. "Those mountains are halfway around the world, sunshine. Our Montana peaks will have to do. But Miss Zimmer says books can take us anywhere." Katherine flushed slightly at being quoted. "I may have been speaking metaphorically." "Metaphorically," Lily repeated carefully, testing the syllables. "That means not really real, but kinda real in your mind." Reid watched the interaction with a mixture of gratitude and discomfort. Katherine Zimmer had awakened something in his daughter that he couldn't provide, a hunger for knowledge, for worlds beyond Whitehorn Valley. He both appreciated it and resented it, this subtle reminder of his own limitations. "Stay for supper," Lily implored, looking at her teacher with naked admiration. "Pa made his special stew. It has carrots from our garden." Before Reid could object, Katherine glanced outside at the darkening sky. "I should start back to town before the light fades completely." "Nonsense," Reid heard himself say, surprising them both. "Storms coming in faster than expected. Roads will be treacherous after dark." Katherine hesitated, but a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, making her decision for her. "If it would not be an imposition." "It wouldn't," Lily answered before Reid could. "Pa always makes enough for leftovers." And just like that, Katherine Zimmer, with her educated words and city manners, was seated at Reid's rough-hewn table, her slender fingers wrapped around an earthenware bowl of venison stew. Reid noticed how she ate carefully but without affectation, complimenting the meal with genuine appreciation. "This is truly wonderful, Mr. Hastings. I had no idea you were such an accomplished cook." "Necessity," he answered simply. "A man either learns to feed himself or starves out here." "Or finds a wife," she replied, then immediately looked embarrassed at her own forwardness. An uncomfortable silence fell, broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls and the occasional pop from the fireplace. Reid felt the familiar walls go up, the ones that kept his emotions in check, that reminded him he had responsibilities to his ranch and his daughter that left no room for complications like Katherine Zimmer. "Pa doesn't want a wife," Lily announced with the brutal honesty of childhood. "He says one heartbreak's enough for any man." Catherine's eyes widened, and Reid nearly choked on his stew. "Lily," he cautioned, his voice low, "but it's what you told Mr. Bennett when he tried to introduce you to his cousin," Lily persisted. Katherine studied her bowl with sudden interest. "Children do have remarkable memories," she observed quietly. Reid changed the subject. "How are things in town? Any news worth sharing?" Katherine seemed grateful for the diversion. The railroad survey team completed their work. "They believe the line will come through Whitehorn by next autumn." "That will change everything," Reid said, not entirely pleased. The railroad meant progress, but also more people, more complications to the simple life he'd carved out. "Change is inevitable, Mr. Hastings. We can only hope to shape it rather than be shaped by it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and saw something beyond the polished schoolteacher. A woman with her own thoughts and convictions, who had chosen to come to this rough territory when she could have found easier employment back east. "What brought you to Montana, Miss Zimmer?" The question came unbidden, but he found he genuinely wanted to know. Something flickered across her face, surprise perhaps that he had asked anything personal. "My father was a professor in Boston. He believed education should reach every corner of America, not just the privileged cities." She paused. "When he passed away 2 years ago, I decided to honor his vision by coming west where teachers are needed most." "That took courage," Reid acknowledged. "Or foolishness," she smiled faintly. "Many of my acquaintances certainly thought so." The wind howled outside, rattling the window frames. Snow was falling in earnest now, accumulating quickly on the windowsills. Katherine rose to look outside, concern evident in her posture. "I have a spare room," Reid said, the words awkward on his tongue. "Used to be the foreman's quarters before I took over the ranch." "You're welcome to it for the night." "Pa, she can sleep in my room." Lily offered excitedly. "We can tell stories." "No, sunshine, Miss Zimmer needs her rest." He turned to Katherine. "The room's small but dry and has its own stove." "I could not possibly." "You can and you will," Reid said more firmly than he intended. "I won't have you risking the mountain road in this weather." Their eyes met in silent negotiation. Reid saw the moment she relented, a slight softening around her mouth, a small nod. "Thank you," she said. "I will leave at first light." Later, after Lily had been tucked in with a story, and Katherine had retired to the spare room, Reid sat before the dying fire and contemplated how his carefully ordered life had been disrupted by a snowstorm and a schoolteacher. He had made peace with solitude years ago. After losing Clara, he had constructed walls around his heart that were as solid as the mountains themselves. Life was about survival, about raising Lily, about maintaining the ranch. Nothing more complicated. Yet as the snow fell silently outside, blanketing the world in pristine white, Reid found himself wondering if he had built those walls to keep pain out, or to keep himself in. Morning dawned clear and brilliant, the storm having passed during the night. The world sparkled under a layer of fresh snow that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Reid was already up, coffee brewed and breakfast cooking when Katherine emerged from the spare room, her hair neatly arranged but her dress showing the wrinkles of having been slept in. "I apologize for my appearance," she said, obviously uncomfortable. "I did not anticipate an overnight stay." "No apology needed," Reid replied, sliding a plate of eggs and bacon toward her. "Eat while it's hot." Lily bounced into the kitchen, her energy seemingly magnified by the snow outside. "Can we build a snowman before Miss Zimmer leaves? Please, Pa." Before Reid could answer, a sharp knock at the door startled them all. He moved quickly, hand instinctively checking that his revolver was within reach, a habit born of frontier necessity. Through the window, he recognized the distinctive hat of Sheriff Morgan. "Morning, Reid," the sheriff said as the door opened. His gaze traveled past Reid to the table where Katherine sat, and his eyebrows rose slightly. "Miss Zimmer, didn't expect to find you here." "The storm," Reid explained tersely, not appreciating the implication in the sheriff's tone. "Roads were impassable." "Of course," Morgan nodded, removing his hat. "Lucky timing as it happens. I've got news you both need to hear." Reid gestured him inside. The sheriff stomped snow from his boots and moved toward the fire, accepting the coffee Reid offered. "Lily," Katherine said smoothly, "why don't you show me that book we were discussing yesterday?" Reid shot her a grateful look as she led his daughter to the other room, giving the men privacy to speak. "What's happened?" Reid asked once they were alone. "Stagecoach was robbed yesterday about 10 miles east," Morgan said, his voice low. "2 passengers wounded. The driver recognized one of the bandits as Jack Harlow." Reid's jaw tightened. Harlow thought he was still in Deer Lodge prison. "Paroled 3 months ago." The sheriff took a long sip of coffee. "But there's more. They took the strongbox, which had the payroll for the mining operation up at Silver Creek. But they also took something else, a passenger manifest and schedule book." "Why would they want that?" "The manifest listed every passenger scheduled on stagecoaches for the next month, including their points of origin and destinations." Morgan's eyes were grave. "Including Miss Zimmer's trip to Helena next week for that teacher's conference." Reid felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. "You think she's in danger?" "I think anyone traveling those roads is in danger until Harlow and his gang are caught." The sheriff lowered his voice further. "But there's something specific about Miss Zimmer you should know. The education board in Helena sent funds with her when she came out here. Quite a substantial sum for the new schoolhouse. Most folks don't know that, but if Harlow has inside information." Reid's mind raced. "Does she keep the money at the school?" "Bank in town, from what I understand. But if Harlow thinks she has access to it, he might target her directly." Reid completed the thought, a knot forming in his stomach. "I've doubled patrols in town, but I can't spare men for escort duty to Helena." The sheriff placed his cup on the table. "Conference isn't for a week. With luck, we'll have Harlow by then." "And if you don't?" Morgan shrugged. "Then I'd advise Miss Zimmer to postpone her trip." When the sheriff had gone, Reid found Katherine and Lily in the small sitting area, heads bent together over an open book. The domestic tranquility of the scene struck him forcefully. How natural it seemed, how right. He pushed the thought away. "Lily, go get your coat if you want to build that snowman," he said. "Just for a little while before Miss Zimmer needs to leave." Once Lily had scampered off, Reid quickly related what Morgan had told him, watching Katherine's face pale. "But the school building fund is crucial," she said once he'd finished. "The territorial governor will be at the conference. Without a personal appeal, we may lose the funding altogether." "Your safety is more important than a building," Reid argued. "To you, perhaps." Her voice was steady despite her evident fear. "But to the children of this valley who deserve proper education, this school represents their future." Reid ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "At least let me escort you to Helena when the time comes. You have a ranch to run, Mr. Hastings, and a daughter to care for. I also have capable hands who can manage things for a few days." Their conversation was interrupted by Lily's return, bundled up and eager for snow play. The matter remained unresolved as they stepped outside into the brilliant morning. For the next hour, Reid found himself enjoying a rare moment of simple pleasure as they constructed an impressive snowman. Katherine proved surprisingly adept, fashioning a remarkably lifelike face using coal pieces and a carrot from Reid's stores. Lily's laughter rang out, pure and unrestrained, as Reid lifted her to place an old hat atop their creation. When it was time for Katherine to leave, Reid insisted on riding with her back to town. She protested but relented when he pointed out that the fresh snow might conceal hazards on the trail. Lily waved from the porch as they departed, calling out, "Come back soon, Miss Zimmer. Pa smiles more when you're here." Reid felt heat creep up his neck despite the cold as Katherine glanced at him, a question in her eyes that he had no answer for. They rode in companionable silence for the first mile, the horses' hooves making soft, crunching sounds in the new snow. Reid remained vigilant, scanning the tree line and ridges for any sign of movement. The beauty of the winter landscape stood in stark contrast to the potential danger lurking within it. "Your daughter is remarkable," Katherine said, finally breaking the silence. "You have done an exceptional job raising her alone." "She makes it easy," Reid replied. "Has her mother's kind heart and quick mind. And her father's determination, I think." Katherine adjusted her scarf against the cold. "Mr. Hastings, about the conference." "I meant what I said," he interrupted. "Either I'll accompany you or you should postpone until Harlow is captured. And if he isn't captured for months, the children cannot wait that long for proper facilities." Reid studied her profile against the snow-covered pines. "You'd risk your life for a schoolhouse." "For what it represents," she corrected. "Civilization. Future hope." She turned to face him directly. "Isn't that what we're all doing out here, risking everything to build something that matters?" The question struck closer to home than she could know. Reid had come west after the war, seeking a place to heal from those terrible years of bloodshed. He'd found purpose in the land, in building something that could outlast him. When Clara died, that purpose had narrowed to one thing: providing Lily with security. "Some risks aren't worth taking," he said finally. "Says the man who tames wild horses and faces down rustlers," she countered with a small smile. "We simply calculate risk differently, Mr. Hastings." They crested a hill that offered a view of Whitehorn in the distance, smoke rising from chimneys against the blue sky. Something about seeing the town from this vantage point, so vulnerable in the vast wilderness, strengthened Reid's resolve. "1 week," he said firmly. "If Harlow isn't caught by then, I'm escorting you to Helena myself." She looked about to argue but then nodded. "Very well, but I'll pay your standard rate for the time." "That won't be necessary." "I insist," she said with surprising firmness. "I won't be indebted." Reid recognized the pride in her stance, the same independence that had brought her to this territory alone. He nodded reluctantly. "As you wish, Miss Zimmer." They continued toward town, unaware that this snowy morning had set in motion events that would irrevocably change both their lives. The week passed without sign of Harlow or his gang, though rumors circulated of sightings in neighboring counties. Reid made preparations for the journey to Helena, arranging for his most trusted hand, Thomas Cooper, to oversee ranch operations in his absence. Explaining the situation to Lily proved more challenging than he had anticipated. "But why do you have to go?" she asked, her small face scrunched in concern as she sat on her bed the night before his departure. "Miss Zimmer needs safe passage to Helena," Reid explained, tucking the quilt around her. "It's important for the school." Lily considered this. "Is it because you like her?" Reid nearly choked. "It's because it's the right thing to do, sunshine." "I think she likes you," Lily continued, undeterred. "She looks at you the way Mrs. Cooper looks at Mr. Cooper." "That's enough of that," Reid said firmly. "Now get some sleep. You'll be good for Mrs. Cooper while I'm away, yes?" "Yes, Pa," Lily yawned, "but I still think Miss Zimmer would make a good mother for me." Reid kissed her forehead, grateful for the dimness that hid his expression. "Dreams now, Lily. Close your eyes." Later, sitting alone by the fire, Reid confronted the uncomfortable truth in his daughter's innocent observation. He had grown to admire Katherine Zimmer, her determination, her intelligence, the grace with which she navigated frontier life despite her refined upbringing. But admiration was all he could permit himself. The cold fact remained: love brought vulnerability, and vulnerability led to heartbreak. He had buried one woman he loved. He would not risk that pain again, nor subject Lily to another loss. Morning arrived with a clear sky and moderate temperatures, favorable conditions for travel. Reid arrived in town with 2 saddled horses and a pack-horse loaded with supplies. The stagecoach would have been faster, but also an obvious target. Better to travel more discreetly, taking less used trails where possible. He found Katherine waiting outside the schoolhouse, dressed in practical riding clothes that surprised him, a split skirt and sturdy jacket that would allow for comfortable travel on horseback. Her hair was braided and pinned securely beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "You came prepared," he observed, dismounting. "I grew up riding," she replied, adjusting a small pack. "My father believed young ladies should be as competent outdoors as in the parlor." "Progressive man." "Practical one," she smiled briefly. though my mother never quite forgave him for my unladylike enthusiasm for galloping. This glimpse into her background intrigued Reid, but he focused on the task at hand. The journey will take 3 days at a steady pace. We'll stop at Bridger Creek the first night. There's a trading post with rooms to let. Second night we'll reach the Lewis homestead. I've met Mrs. Lewis at church gatherings, Katherine nodded. Very kind woman. Her husband owes me a favor, Reid said, securing Katherine's pack to her saddle. We should reach Helena by midday the third day, well before your conference begins. Sheriff Morgan approached as they prepared to depart, his expression grave. No sign of Harlow, but keep your guard up. I sent telegrams to the sheriffs along your route. They're aware you're coming through. Reid nodded, checking his rifle in its scabbard. The weight of his revolver at his hip was reassuring. Any specific areas to avoid? Granite Pass has had several robberies, Morgan advised. Taking the longer route through Wilson Valley might be safer. Adds half a day, but might be worth it, Reid agreed. He mounted his horse and looked to Katherine. Ready. She swung into her saddle with practiced ease that impressed him. Ready, Mr. Hastings. They rode out of town as the church bell struck 8, following the eastbound road before turning north onto a less-traveled trail. Reid maintained a vigilant watch, noting every movement in the trees, every distant sound. Katherine matched his pace without complaint, sitting her horse with the confidence of someone who had indeed grown up riding. Your father taught you well, Reid observed after a few hours of travel when they paused to rest the horses by a small stream. He believed education extended beyond books. She smiled at the memory, watching as her horse drank. He was a professor of literature, but he quoted Emerson constantly, "The first wealth is health." Wise man. He would have loved it here, she said, gesturing to the mountains rising before them. All this untamed beauty. He always said cities cage the human spirit. Reid studied her, seeing beyond the schoolteacher to the woman beneath. Yet you chose to teach rather than, become a professor yourself. Women professors are still quite rare, even in progressive Boston. A shadow crossed her face. Besides, after my father died, circumstances made remaining there difficult. Something in her tone suggested deeper waters, but Reid didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past they'd left behind. It was an unwritten rule not to dig too deeply unless invited. They continued their journey, the conversation flowing more easily than Reid had expected. Katherine spoke of her students with obvious affection, describing their progress and personalities with insight that showed her dedication. Reid found himself sharing stories of the ranch, of Lily's early years, of the challenges and rewards of carving a life from the Montana wilderness. By late afternoon, they had covered good ground, the trail winding through pine forests and across high meadows. The November sun began its early descent, casting long shadows across their path. Reid estimated they would reach Bridger Creek trading post within 2 hours, good timing for securing lodging before full darkness. There, he said, pointing to a plume of smoke rising beyond the next ridge. Bridger Creek, we'll find food and shelter there. Katherine nodded, adjusting her hat against the lowering sun. I confess I'm looking forward to dismounting. It has been some time since I rode this distance. You've handled it well, Reid said, surprising himself with the compliment. Many experienced riders would be complaining by now. A lady may feel discomfort, Mr. Hastings, but she needn't inflict awareness of it on others. Reid almost smiled at the primness in her voice. And if this lady is also a frontier schoolteacher, then she especially cannot show weakness, Katherine replied more seriously. Out here, respect is too precious a commodity to squander on complaints. Reid understood that sentiment all too well. The West demanded strength, or at least the appearance of it. Vulnerability was a luxury few could afford. The trading post appeared as they crested the ridge, a substantial log structure with several outbuildings and a corral. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lantern light glowed in the windows against the gathering dusk. Several horses stood in the corral, and a wagon was parked beside a lean-to shelter. More travelers than I expected this time of year, Reid observed, suddenly cautious. Stay close as we approach. They rode into the yard at a measured pace. Reid's hand rested near his revolver, eyes scanning the buildings and the faces of 2 men who emerged from the main structure. He relaxed slightly when he recognized Jacob Bridger, the post's proprietor. "Reid Hastings," Bridger called in greeting. "Been a spell since you've come this way." "Jacob," Reid acknowledged, dismounting and offering a hand to help Katherine down. She accepted it briefly, her gloved fingers light in his palm before she stood on her own. "Looking for lodging for the night. This is Miss Zimmer, Whitehorn's schoolteacher." "Ma'am," Bridger tipped his hat respectfully. "Got one room left. Been busier than usual with folks heading to Helena for that railroad meeting." "One room will be fine," Reid said before Katherine could respond. "Miss Zimmer can take it. I'll bunk in your storage room if you've still got that cot there." Bridger nodded. "Sure do. Come in and warm yourselves. My wife's got stew on." Inside, the trading post's main room served as store, tavern, and gathering place all in one. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with everything from ammunition to fabric to canned goods. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with several tables arranged before it. 5 men sat at various tables, eating or playing cards. Their eyes followed Katherine as she entered, though most had the decency to look away when Reid's gaze swept over them. Mrs. Bridger, a sturdy woman with a kind face, emerged from the back room wiping her hands on an apron. "Well now, company for supper, and a lady too. Been too long since we've had feminine conversation, hasn't it, Jacob?" Katherine smiled warmly. "Your establishment is most welcome after a day's travel, Mrs. Bridger." "Sarah, please," the woman insisted. "Any friend of Reid's is welcome here. I'll show you to your room so you can freshen up before supper." As Katherine followed Mrs. Bridger toward a hallway at the back, Reid took the opportunity to assess their fellow travelers. 2 were obviously freighters, their weather-beaten faces and calloused hands marking them as men who made their living on the trails. Another appeared to be a drummer, a traveling salesman, with his neat attire and sample case beside his chair. The remaining 2 drew Reid's closer attention. They sat apart from the others, speaking in low voices. Both wore trail clothes that had seen better days, and their unshaven faces and watchful eyes spoke of men accustomed to rough company. Not unusual types for the frontier, but Reid made note of them nonetheless. Bridger noticed his observation. "Came in yesterday," he said quietly. "Heading to Helena, they said, keep to themselves mostly." Reid nodded, deciding to remain vigilant but not overly concerned. The West attracted all types, many with good reason to be reticent about their business. When Katherine returned, her face freshly washed and her hair neatly arranged, Reid was struck again by her natural grace. Even in practical traveling clothes, she carried herself with a dignity that commanded respect. Mrs. Bridger set bowls of venison stew before them, along with slabs of fresh bread and mugs of hot coffee. "This is wonderful," Katherine said after her first bite. "You must share your recipe, Mrs. Bridger." The women fell into easy conversation about cooking and preserving, topics that might have seemed mundane but represented survival skills in the frontier. Reid ate in companionable silence, occasionally exchanging observations with Jacob about trail conditions and livestock prices. The evening progressed pleasantly until one of the rough-looking men approached their table, swaying slightly with the effects of whiskey. He stood too close to Katherine, looking down at her with an appraising gaze that made Reid's shoulders tighten. "Don't see many fine ladies out this way," the man said, his voice carrying a slurred edge. "Traveling alone with this fellow doesn't seem proper." Before Reid could respond, Katherine looked up with calm dignity. "I assure you, sir, everything about my journey is entirely proper. Mr. Hastings is escorting me to a teachers' conference in Helena." The man snorted. "Teacher, are you? Seems a waste of pretty features." Reid stood slowly, his hand resting on the table. "The lady answered your question. Now I suggest you return to your table." The second rough man had risen as well, watching the exchange with narrowed eyes. The room had gone quiet, the other travelers sensing potential trouble. "Meant no offense," the first man said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Just making conversation." "Find another topic," Reid suggested evenly. For a moment tension stretched between them, then Jacob Bridger stepped forward. "Gentlemen, I run a peaceful establishment. Keep it that way or find your beds elsewhere." The first man raised his hands in mock surrender, backing away. "No quarrel here, just admiring the ladies' company." He rejoined his companion, and conversation gradually resumed around the room. Reid sat back down, noting that Katherine appeared composed despite the unpleasant interaction. "Thank you," she said quietly, "though I've handled worse in the schoolroom from certain fathers who question a woman's authority to teach their sons." "Doesn't make it right," Reid replied, still watching the men from the corner of his eye. "No," she agreed, "but it makes it manageable." Later, when Katherine had retired to her room, Reid helped Jacob close up the trading post. The other travelers had gone to their accommodations, including the two rough men who had taken the loft space above the main room. "Don't like the look of those two," Jacob admitted as he and Reid checked the doors, "but can't turn away paying customers without cause." "Keep your shotgun handy tonight," Reid advised. "And I'll be sleeping with one eye open." "Always do," Jacob agreed. "Trail to Helena's been dangerous lately. Heard about Jack Harlow being on the loose." "That's partly why we're traveling carefully," Reid confirmed. "Miss Zimmer has important business in Helena, but her safety comes first." Jacob glanced toward the closed door of Katherine's room. "She seems a fine woman, educated but not haughty about it like some." "She is," Reid agreed simply. "Clara's been gone 6 years now," Jacob observed carefully. Reid had known the Bridgers for many years. They had attended his wedding to Clara and sent condolences when she died. "A man gets lonely, Reid. Especially raising a child alone." "I manage," Reid said, his tone closing the subject. Jacob raised his hands in surrender, much as the rough traveler had earlier, but with genuine respect. "Just an observation." "No offense meant." "None taken," Reid replied, though he felt a familiar defensiveness rise within him. "The storage room still this way." The cot in Bridger's storage room was narrow but comfortable enough. Reid lay awake for some time, listening to the creaks and settling sounds of the log building. His conversation with Jacob had stirred memories he usually kept firmly contained, of Clara's laugh, of their dreams for the ranch, of the future they had planned together. He had loved her completely, with the unbridled passion of youth and the steady commitment of a man who knew his own mind. When childbirth took her, something fundamental had broken inside him. He had continued living for Lily's sake, but a part of him had been buried alongside Clara. Yet now, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams, Reid confronted an uncomfortable truth. Katherine Zimmer had awakened something he had thought long dead, a quickening of interest, an awareness that extended beyond mere appreciation of her qualities. It was unwelcome, this stirring of feelings, dangerous even. Sleep came eventually, but it brought troubled dreams of Clara's face fading into Katherine's, of Lily calling for a mother, of horses galloping toward a cliff's edge that Reid couldn't see until it was almost too late. He woke before dawn, alert and restless. Checking his watch in the faint light filtering through the storage room's single window, he saw it was not yet 5, early enough to check on the horses and prepare for departure before the other travelers stirred. The main room was silent as Reid moved through it, the fire banked to coals that cast a dim red glow. He paused, noticing that the loft where the two rough men had bedded down appeared empty. Perhaps they had left even earlier, though it seemed unusual to depart before daylight. Outside, the pre-dawn air carried a sharp chill. Stars still glittered overhead, though the eastern sky showed the first hint of lightning. Reid walked to the small stable where their horses had been put up for the night, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. The stable door stood partially open, though Reid distinctly remembered closing it securely the night before. Alert now, he drew his revolver and approached cautiously. From within came the soft sounds of horses moving restlessly. Reid pushed the door wider, allowing the faint light from the yard's single lantern to penetrate the darkness. What he saw made his blood run cold. Their packhorse stood as they had left it, but Katherine's mount was saddled and being led toward the door by one of the rough men from the previous evening. The second man was in the process of saddling Reid's horse. "Going somewhere with our mounts?" Reid asked evenly, his revolver aimed at the first man's chest. Both men froze. The first recovered quickly, his hand dropping toward his holster. "I wouldn't," Reid warned, cocking his weapon. "Next move you make better be raising those hands." For a tense moment it seemed the man might risk drawing. Then with obvious reluctance he raised his hands slowly. His companion followed suit. "Just borrowing transportation," the first man claimed. "Would have left payment." "I'm sure," Reid replied skeptically. "Empty your holsters, 2 fingers only." As the men reluctantly disarmed, depositing their revolvers on the ground. Light flared behind Reid. He sensed rather than saw someone enter the stable doorway. "Everything all right, Reid?" Jacob Bridger's voice was steady, and Reid knew without looking that the trading post owner would have his shotgun ready. "Caught these two borrowing our horses," Reid explained, not taking his eyes off the men. "Think they were planning an early departure." "Mighty inconsiderate," Bridger observed dryly. "Sheriff Miller's only 15 miles south. Could reach him by noon if I send my boy riding hard." The would-be horse thieves exchanged glances, clearly calculating their options. Horse theft in the territories often meant a hanging if the victims were vengefully inclined. "We meant no harm," the second man said, speaking for the first time. His voice held a nervous edge. "Times are hard, we needed to reach Helena." "So does Miss Zimmer," Reid replied coldly. "And she paid for her transportation." Further discussion was interrupted by Katherine herself appearing in the doorway beside Bridger. She wore her riding skirt and jacket, obviously having dressed quickly at the commotion. "What's happening?" she asked, taking in the scene with remarkable composure. "These men were planning to leave with our horses," Reid explained, not lowering his weapon. "Mr. Bridger and I interrupted their departure." Katherine's eyes widened slightly, but she showed no fear. "I see. How fortunate you're an early riser, Mr. Hastings." "Indeed," Reid agreed. He addressed the thieves again. "Now we have a decision to make, Sheriff or Silver." "Silver," the first man said quickly. Reid nodded. 3 times the worth of the horses you tried to take paid to Mr. Bridger here, plus you work his wood pile until noon. Then you leave on foot in the opposite direction from us." The men agreed readily, clearly relieved to avoid legal consequences. Under Bridger's watchful shotgun, they emptied their pockets of money, producing a sum that satisfied the trading post owner. "I'll see these two start on that wood pile," Bridger said. "You and Miss Zimmer best get an early start yourselves." By the time the eastern sky had bloomed into full dawn, Reid and Katherine were miles from the trading post, having departed as soon as possible after the incident. Reid maintained a vigilant watch behind them, though he doubted the would-be thieves would pursue them on foot. "Do you think they were simply opportunists, or connected to Harlow?" Katherine asked as they rode side by side along a ridge trail that offered good visibility in all directions. "Hard to say," Reid admitted. "Could be either. Horse theft is common enough without being part of a larger scheme." "You handled them rather efficiently," she observed, "though I was surprised by your mercy." Reid glanced at her. "Hanging men for attempted theft seems excessive when no one was harmed." "Many in the territories would disagree." "Many in the territories have forgotten the difference between justice and vengeance," Reid replied. "I've seen enough killing to last several lifetimes." Katherine studied him with new interest. "The war?" Reid nodded once, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. The war between the states had left scars deeper than the visible one that ran along his left forearm. Those 4 years had taught him how quickly civilization could crumble, how thin the veneer of humanity could become. Sensing his reluctance, Katherine changed the subject. "How much ground do you hope to cover today?" "If we maintain a good pace, we should reach the Lewis homestead by nightfall," Reid replied, grateful for her perceptiveness. "It's about 30 miles. Longer than yesterday's ride, but better trail conditions." The day unfolded with a rhythm of steady travel, punctuated by brief rests to water the horses and stretch cramped muscles. They ate a cold lunch of bread, jerky, and dried apples while seated on a fallen log beside a clear stream. The November sun provided little warmth, but the physical exertion of riding kept them comfortable despite the chill air. Katherine proved to be excellent company, intelligent without being pretentious, observant of the natural beauty around them, and possessed of a dry wit that occasionally surprised a laugh from Reid. By mid-afternoon, he found himself relaxing in her presence in a way he rarely did with anyone outside his ranch hands and Lily. "May I ask you something personal, Mr. Hastings?" Katherine ventured as they rode through a particularly beautiful stretch of pine forest, the late afternoon sun slanting golden light between the trees. Reid hesitated, then nodded. "You may ask." "I may choose not to answer." "Fair enough," she acknowledged. "I've noticed you maintain a certain distance from the townspeople, even those who clearly respect you. Is that deliberate?" The question was more perceptive than Reid had expected. He considered his response carefully. The ranch demands most of my attention. Socializing is a luxury of time I rarely have. Is that the only reason? Reid looked at her directly. What are you really asking, Miss Zimmer? Katherine met his gaze without flinching. Whether your isolation is practical or philosophical, whether you believe connection with others is unimportant or simply inconvenient. That's quite direct for a schoolteacher, Reid observed, buying time to consider his answer. Teachers must be direct when the lesson matters, she replied simply. Reid found himself responding with unexpected honesty. After Clara died, I learned that attachments are vulnerabilities. Every person you care for is someone who can be taken from you. Every hope is an opportunity for disappointment. A bleak philosophy. A realistic one, Reid countered. The frontier doesn't reward optimism, Miss Zimmer. It rewards caution and self-reliance. And yet you've opened your heart to Lily. She's my blood, my responsibility. Katherine was quiet for a moment, then softly, is that all she is to you? A responsibility. Of course not, Reid replied, surprised by the question. She's everything. Then you haven't closed yourself off completely, Katherine observed. You've simply drawn a smaller circle around what you'll allow yourself to love. The insight struck uncomfortably close to truth. Reid shifted in his saddle, suddenly eager to change the subject. The Lewis homestead should be visible once we crest that next rise. They have a good well and Mrs. Lewis sets a fine table. Katherine accepted the conversational diversion gracefully. I look forward to meeting Mr. Lewis. His wife speaks highly of him. The Lewis homestead appeared as Reid had promised. A substantial log house with several outbuildings, a large barn, and fields now fallow for the winter. Smoke rose invitingly from the chimney, and a dog announced their arrival with enthusiastic barking. A man emerged from the barn, shading his eyes against the setting sun to identify the visitors. Reid Hastings, he called in greeting, striding forward to meet them. Martha said you might be passing through. His eyes moved to Katherine with obvious curiosity. John, Reid acknowledged, dismounting. This is Miss Katherine Zimmer, Whitehorn's schoolteacher. We're traveling to Helena for the education conference. Ma'am, John Lewis touched the brim of his hat respectfully. Any friend of Reid's is welcome here. Martha will be pleased to have female company. As if summoned by her name, Martha Lewis appeared in the doorway of the house. A woman in her 40s with a capable manner and kind eyes, she wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to greet them. Miss Zimmer, what a pleasant surprise, and Reid, it's been too long. The welcome was genuine and warm. Within an hour, Reid and Katherine were seated at the Lewis's sturdy table, enjoying a hearty meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh-baked bread. The Lewis children, 2 boys aged 12 and 14, watched Katherine with undisguised curiosity as she described the school in Whitehorn. We have 16 students regularly attending now, she told them. From 6 to 15 years of age. The older boys come mainly in winter when ranch work slows. Do you teach Latin? The older boy, William, asked eagerly. I've been reading about Roman history in Father's books. I do indeed, Katherine replied, clearly pleased by his interest. Though not as thoroughly as I would like, given our limited resources. Martha Lewis shook her head in wonder. William devours every book he can find. John and I do our best, but out here. Education is the greatest challenge of frontier life, Katherine agreed. But also its greatest hope. Young minds like William's will build the future of these territories. The conversation flowed easily through the meal and into the evening as they gathered around the fireplace. John and Reid discussed ranching matters and local news, while Martha engaged Katherine in conversation about everything from education to fashion to the challenges of maintaining a household miles from the nearest town. When it was time to retire for the night, Martha showed Katherine to a small but comfortable bedroom, while Reid was directed to a cot in the study, John's pride and joy, a room lined with bookshelves containing volumes he had painstakingly transported west over many years. Your collection is impressive, Reid observed as John lit a lamp in the study. I don't recall it being quite so extensive last time I visited. Martha says it's my folly, John admitted with a smile. But I believe books are as essential as ammunition out here. They keep the mind from becoming as wild as the country. Reid ran a finger along the leather-bound spines. Clara felt the same way. She brought a trunk of books when we married. Insisted they were as important as cooking pots. A wise woman, John said quietly. How is Lily taking to her studies? Enthusiastically. Miss Zimmer says she has a gift for mathematics. John glanced toward the closed door, lowering his voice. Speaking of Miss Zimmer, Martha has already decided she would make you an excellent wife. Reid stiffened. Martha should direct her matchmaking elsewhere. She means well, John said, raising his hands in a placating gesture. And you must admit, a woman of Miss Zimmer's quality is rare in these parts, educated, refined, yet not afraid of frontier hardships, and easy on the eyes besides. I'm escorting her to Helena as a matter of safety and courtesy, Reid stated firmly. Nothing more. John studied him for a moment, then nodded. Of course, well, rest well, we rise early here. Left alone, Reid sat on the edge of the cot and pulled off his boots, trying to ignore the irritation John's comments had stirred. Was his interest in Katherine so transparent that even the Lewises had noticed it? The thought was unsettling. He had believed himself more guarded. Sleep came reluctantly, and when it did, his dreams were again troubled, this time with images of Clara looking at him with sad eyes, saying words he couldn't quite hear over the sound of a rushing river. He woke before dawn, feeling unrested and on edge. Breakfast was a hearty affair, with Martha insisting they take provisions for their final day of travel. As they prepared to depart, William approached Katherine shyly, offering her a small book. For your journey, Miss Zimmer, he said, his face flushed with embarrassment. Father says I may lend it to you. It's Virgil's Aeneid, perhaps. Perhaps you could write to tell me what you think of it. Katherine accepted the book with genuine pleasure. I would be honored, William, and I promise to return it when next I pass this way. The boy beamed, and Reid felt a pang of something like envy at the easy connection Katherine had formed with the Lewis family in just one evening. She possessed a gift for drawing people out, for making them feel valued and heard. It was, he supposed, what made her an exceptional teacher. They departed with promises to stop again on their return journey. The day was clear but cold, with a brisk wind that carried the scent of snow despite the blue sky. Reid estimated they would reach Helena by mid-afternoon if they maintained a steady pace. The Lewis family is remarkable, Katherine observed as they rode. To build such a life so far from everything familiar, it takes tremendous courage. And partnership, Reid added, thinking of the obvious bond between John and Martha. They face the frontier's challenges together. Yes, Katherine agreed softly. I imagine that makes all the difference. They rode in companionable silence for several miles, the trail winding through stands of pine and across open meadows where deer grazed in the distance. Reid found himself relaxing into the rhythm of travel, his earlier unease gradually fading in the face of the day's simple pleasures: good weather, responsive horses, and surprisingly agreeable company. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses beside a small stream. Reid built a small fire to heat coffee, while Katherine unwrapped bread and cheese from Martha's provisions. As they ate, Reid noticed Katherine glancing repeatedly at the northern sky, where clouds were beginning to gather. Weather's changing, he acknowledged her unspoken concern. But we should reach Helena before any storm hits. I hope so, she replied. November storms can be unpredictable. Reid was about to respond when the distinctive crack of a rifle shot echoed across the valley. Instinctively, he grabbed Katherine's arm and pulled her down behind a fallen log, his hand already drawing his revolver. What? She began, but Reid pressed a finger to his lips, scanning the surrounding ridgeline. A second shot rang out, closer this time, and Reid saw dirt kick up 10 feet to their left. Whoever was shooting had them in their sights but wasn't yet within reliable range. We need to reach the horses, Reid whispered urgently. Stay low and move when I say. Katherine nodded, her face pale but composed. The horses, startled by the gunfire, had moved several yards away but hadn't bolted completely, a testament to their training. Reid surveyed their position. They were exposed in the small clearing, with limited cover between them and the horses. The shooter appeared to be on the ridge to the west, giving them a commanding view of the area. When I fire toward that ridge, run for the horses, Reid instructed. Don't stop, don't look back, get mounted and ride for those trees. He nodded toward a dense stand of pines about 100 yards east. What about you? Katherine asked, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. "I'll be right behind you, ready." She took a deep breath and nodded. Reid raised himself slightly and fired 3 rapid shots toward the ridgeline where he'd seen movement. Immediately, Katherine sprang up and ran for the horses, moving with surprising speed. Reid fired twice more, then turned to follow her. He had covered half the distance when pain exploded in his left shoulder, the impact spinning him partially around. He stumbled but kept his feet, aware that stopping meant death. Through a haze of pain, he saw Katherine reach the horses, grabbing their reins with remarkable presence of mind. Instead of mounting immediately, she turned toward Reid, her eyes widening as she saw him stagger. For a terrible moment he thought she might run back to him, a fatal mistake with an active shooter. But she was smarter than that. She quickly mounted her horse and led Reid's mount closer to him, minimizing his exposed time. With a surge of effort, Reid reached his horse and pulled himself into the saddle, every movement sending white-hot pain through his shoulder. Blood was already soaking his coat, but he focused on urging his horse forward, following Katherine toward the shelter of the pines. More shots rang out behind them, but they were already out of effective range, the trees growing closer with each stride. Reid's vision blurred at the edges, but he concentrated on staying upright, on keeping his horse moving forward. They reached the pine forest and continued riding for several minutes, putting distance between themselves and their attackers. Finally, in a small, protected hollow, Katherine reined in her horse and quickly dismounted. Reid tried to follow suit but found his strength failing as he swung his leg over. He half dismounted, half fell, Katherine rushing to catch him before he hit the ground. "You're shot," she said, her voice tight with concern as she helped him sit with his back against a tree. "Noticed that," Reid managed through gritted teeth. The world was starting to spin around him, shock and blood loss taking their toll. With efficient movements, Katherine removed his coat and tore open his shirt to examine the wound. "The bullet went through," she reported, her voice clinical despite the worry in her eyes. "But you're losing too much blood." She quickly retrieved her saddlebag and pulled out a small kit. "My father insisted I learn basic medical care before coming west," she explained, extracting bandages and a small bottle. "This will hurt." Before Reid could respond, she poured liquid from the bottle directly onto the wound. The pain was immediate and intense, forcing a strangled groan from his throat. "Whiskey," she explained apologetically. "Best disinfectant available." Working quickly, she pressed clean bandages against both the entry and exit wounds, then bound them tightly with strips of cloth. Her hands were steady, her movements precise despite the dire circumstances. "We need to keep moving," Reid said weakly once she had finished. "They'll be tracking us." "You're in no condition to ride far," Katherine argued, her practical nature asserting itself. "Helena is still hours away, and you could bleed to death before we reach it." "Alternatives are limited," Reid pointed out, trying to focus through the pain and growing lightheadedness. "Can't stay here." Katherine bit her lip, thinking rapidly. "The map you showed me yesterday. Wasn't there a line cabin marked about 5 miles east of here, used by ranchers during cattle drives?" Reid nodded slowly, impressed by her memory. "Belongs to the Circle T Ranch. Basic shelter, might have supplies." "Then that's our destination," Katherine decided. "Can you stay in the saddle if I lead your horse?" Reid wanted to insist he could ride unassisted, but the darkening edges of his vision told him otherwise. "Yes," he conceded, "but we need to be alert. Whoever shot me wasn't a random bandit." "Harlow?" Katherine asked as she helped him to his feet. "Possibly," Reid swayed slightly, leaning on her more than he wanted to admit, "or someone who knew our route." With considerable effort, Reid remounted his horse. Katherine secured his reins to her saddle horn, then mounted her own horse. The arrangement was humiliating for Reid, being led like a child on a pony, but necessary. Already the cold was seeping into him, combining with blood loss to make his thoughts sluggish. They rode eastward through the pine forest, keeping to the densest cover possible. Katherine set a pace that balanced urgency with caution, frequently glancing back to check on Reid. For his part, Reid focused on staying conscious and upright, fighting the waves of pain and dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. Time became fluid, measured only by the swaying motion of the horse beneath him and the periodic jolts of pain from his wounded shoulder. Reid found himself drifting in and out of full awareness. at times seeing Clara riding beside him instead of Katherine, at times hearing Lily's laughter in the rustling of pine needles. "Reid," Katherine's voice cut through the fog, using his given name for the first time. "Reid, stay with me. The cabin is just ahead." He blinked, forcing himself back to clarity. Through the trees, he could make out the shape of a small log structure in a clearing. Smoke rose from its chimney, a concerning sign. "Someone's there," he managed to warn, his hand moving instinctively toward his revolver despite his weakness. Katherine nodded, having already noticed. "We have few options," she said quietly. "You need shelter and medical attention." Reid wanted to argue, to insist they continue to Helena, but the truth was undeniable. He was in no condition to travel farther. "Approach cautiously," he instructed. "If anything seems wrong, leave me and ride for help." The look she gave him made it clear she had no intention of abandoning him, regardless of his instructions. Reid found himself strangely comforted by that stubbornness, even as he worried for her safety. They emerged from the trees into the small clearing. The line cabin was a simple structure, one room with a stone chimney, built to provide basic shelter for Cowboys working cattle far from the main ranch. A small corral stood empty beside it, and wood was stacked neatly against the northern wall. The door opened as they approached, and a man stepped onto the small porch, rifle in hand but not raised. He appeared to be in his 60s, with a weathered face and silver hair beneath a battered hat. He surveyed them carefully, his eyes lingering on Reid's blood-soaked bandages. "Looks like you folks had some trouble," he observed mildly. "We were ambushed about 5 miles west," Katherine explained, her voice steady. "Mr. Hastings has been shot. We're seeking shelter and assistance if you're willing to provide it." The old man studied them for another moment, then nodded once. "Been expecting trouble on these trails. Dismount and come in. I'm Thomas Morgan, line rider for Circle T." Katherine helped Reid from his horse, supporting him as they made their way to the cabin. Inside, they found a Spartan but clean interior. A stone fireplace with a cooking hook, a rough-hewn table with 2 stools, a narrow cot against one wall, and supplies stored on shelves along another. The warmth from the fire was immediate and welcome. "Put him on the cot," Morgan directed. "I've got some medical supplies." As Katherine helped Reid to the cot, Morgan retrieved a wooden box from a shelf and placed it on the table. "Military surgeon during the war," he explained briefly. "Not much call for those skills these days, thankfully, but I keep a hand in." Reid felt a surge of relief. A former military surgeon was the best possible assistance they could have found in these circumstances. He allowed Katherine and Morgan to ease him onto the cot, the movement sending fresh waves of pain through his shoulder. Morgan examined Katherine's bandaging job with professional assessment. "Good work stopping the bleeding. Military background yourself, ma'am?" "No," Katherine replied. "My father believed in practical education. He taught at Harvard Medical School before moving to the literature department." "Sensible man," Morgan approved. He began removing the bandages carefully. "Going to need to clean this properly and stitch it." "Got some laudanum if you want it," he offered to Reid. Reid shook his head. "Need to stay alert." Morgan gave him an appraising look. "Suit yourself, but this won't be pleasant." While Morgan prepared his instruments, Katherine removed Reid's boots and covered him with a blanket, her movements gentle but efficient. "The horses?" Reid asked, trying to focus on practical matters rather than the pain. "I'll see to them," Katherine assured him. "Rest now, you're safe." As she moved away to care for the horses, Morgan leaned closer to Reid. "Ambushed, you say? Any idea by whom?" "Possibly Jack Harlow's gang," Reid replied quietly. "He escaped prison recently. We were traveling to Helena for an education conference." Morgan nodded thoughtfully. "Heard about Harlow, bad business. Been several robberies along these trails lately." He paused in his preparation of surgical thread. "The lady is a schoolteacher." "From Whitehorn," Reid confirmed. "Katherine Zimmer. I'm escorting her to Helena." "Quite a woman," Morgan observed, glancing toward the door. "Not many would keep their composure in such circumstances." "She's exceptional," Reid admitted, the pain and blood loss lowering his usual guard. Morgan's weathered face creased in a slight smile. "I see." When Katherine returned, Morgan had everything prepared for treating Reid's wound. "Ma'am, if you could assist," he requested. Need someone to help clean while I prepare the sutures. Katherine nodded and followed his instructions precisely, helping to wash the wound with hot water and whiskey. Despite his determination to remain stoic, Reid couldn't prevent a sharp intake of breath when they cleaned the ragged edges of the bullet holes. "Sorry," Katherine murmured, her face close to his, her eyes meeting his briefly with genuine concern. "I've had worse," Reid managed, though in truth he couldn't immediately recall when. The next hour passed in a haze of pain as Morgan stitched both the entry and exit wounds with practiced efficiency. Katherine assisted without flinching, handing instruments and wiping away blood as needed. When it was finally done, Reid lay exhausted but clearer-headed, the worst of the pain having settled into a persistent but manageable throbbing. "He'll need rest," Morgan told Katherine as they washed up at the small basin. "And plenty of fluids, fever's the danger now." "We're expected in Helena," Reid protested weakly from the cot. "The conference can proceed without you," Katherine interrupted firmly. "I'm not leaving you in this condition." "The men who shot me will still be looking for us," Reid argued. "Staying here puts all of us at risk." Morgan considered this. He's right about that. Harlow's gang isn't known for giving up easily. "Then what do you suggest?" Katherine asked, looking between the two men. "Reid cannot travel." Morgan scratched his beard thoughtfully. Circle T's main ranch is about 15 miles southeast. They could send men back here as protection, maybe a wagon to transport him more comfortably. "Could you take a message there?" Katherine asked. Morgan nodded. "Was planning a supply run tomorrow anyway. Could go today instead." "Then it's settled," Katherine decided, her tone brooking no argument. "Mr. Morgan will ride for help and I will stay with Reid." Reid wanted to object. The idea of Katherine placing herself in danger for his sake was unacceptable, but the practicality of the plan was undeniable. In his condition, he needed care that only she could provide until help arrived. "If you're staying, you should know how to use this," Morgan said, retrieving a shotgun from beside the door and offering it to Katherine. "Simpler than a rifle. Just point and pull the trigger." Katherine accepted the weapon with surprising familiarity. "My father believed in self-sufficiency," she explained, seeing Reid's expression. "Shotgun was his preferred home defense." Morgan gathered supplies for his journey while Katherine prepared a simple meal from the cabin's stores: beans, salt pork, and coffee. The normality of these activities stood in stark contrast to the danger they had faced only hours earlier. "I'll leave within the hour," Morgan told them as they ate. "Should reach the ranch by nightfall. Expect help to arrive by midday tomorrow, assuming the weather holds." Katherine glanced toward the small window where snow had begun to fall lightly. "And if it doesn't?" Morgan's expression sobered. "Then it might take longer. But Circle T looks after its own, and I count you folks as under my protection now. Help will come." As Morgan prepared to depart, Reid called him over to the cot. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. "Miss Zimmer is carrying funds for a new schoolhouse in Whitehorn. That might be why we were targeted specifically." Morgan nodded grimly. "I'll make sure the ranch sends enough men, and I'll bring my rifle when I ride out. Between us, the lady will be safe." Once Morgan had departed, Katherine secured the cabin door and added wood to the fire. The single room felt suddenly smaller, more intimate with just the two of them. She moved efficiently, checking Reid's bandages, helping him sip water, adjusting the blanket over him. "You should have gone with Morgan," Reid said, watching her move about the cabin. "Safer at the main ranch." "And leave you defenseless," she shook her head. "I made my decision, Mr. Hastings. Please respect it." "Reid," he corrected quietly. "After today, I think we're well past Mr. Hastings." A small smile touched her lips. "Reid, then." She sat on one of the stools beside the cot. "How is your pain?" "Manageable," he lied. In truth, his shoulder felt as though it were on fire, and a deep ache had settled into the surrounding muscles. Katherine's expression made it clear she didn't believe him. There's no virtue in unnecessary suffering. "The laudanum clouds the mind," Reid interrupted. "If Harlow's men find us before help arrives, I need to be alert." She studied him for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. "At least try to rest." "I'll keep watch." Despite his determination to remain vigilant, exhaustion and blood loss soon conspired against Reid. He drifted into uneasy sleep, waking periodically to find Katherine either tending the fire, checking his bandages, or sitting by the window with the shotgun across her lap, watching the snow fall with quiet intensity. During one such awakening, he found her placing a cool cloth on his forehead, her face close to his in the dim light. "You have a slight fever," she explained softly. "Nothing alarming yet, but we need to monitor it." Reid caught her wrist gently as she moved to withdraw. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with pain and emotion. "You saved my life today." "You would have done the same," she replied simply. "Yes," he agreed, "but I'm a rancher in wild country. You're a schoolteacher who should be safely attending lectures in Helena, not hiding in a line cabin with a wounded man while killers search for us." Katherine sat beside him on the edge of the cot. "Perhaps I'm exactly where I'm meant to be." Something in her tone, a quiet certainty, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fever beginning to burn through him, made Reid's carefully constructed walls waver. For a moment he allowed himself to see not just the composed schoolteacher or the surprisingly capable frontier woman, but Katherine herself, brave, intelligent, compassionate, and undeniably beautiful in the firelight. "Why did you really come west, Katherine?" he asked softly. "The truth." She looked down at her hands, then back at his face. "My father's death left me in difficult circumstances. The university had promised him a pension, but legal complications arose. My mother had passed years earlier, and I had no brothers or influential relatives to advocate for me." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "A senior professor offered a solution. Marriage to him would secure my financial future and social position. He was 40 years my senior, a colleague of my father's." Reid felt a surge of indignation on her behalf. "You refused." "I did, which made my position in Boston society uncomfortable. The Territorial Education Board was seeking qualified teachers. It offered independence and purpose, even if it meant leaving everything familiar behind." "Brave choice," Reid observed. "Or desperate one," she countered with a small smile. "But I have never regretted it. Teaching these children, helping to build something lasting in this new place, it gives meaning to my days in a way Boston society never could." Reid understood that sentiment completely. It echoed his own reasons for coming west after the war, the desire to build rather than destroy, to create something from nothing, to find purpose in honest work. Before he could respond, however, a spasm of pain shot through his shoulder, forcing a sharp intake of breath. Katherine immediately reached for the water cup, helping him drink. "The fever is getting worse," she said with concern, her cool hand resting briefly on his forehead. "You need rest. We can talk more when you're stronger." Reid wanted to protest, to continue this rare moment of connection, but the pain and growing fever were becoming harder to fight. He nodded slightly and allowed his eyes to close, Katherine's hand a comforting presence on his arm as he drifted back into fitful sleep. The night passed in fragments for Reid, periods of restless sleep interrupted by Katherine changing his bandages, coaxing water into him, or applying cool cloths to his forehead as the fever rose. In his more lucid moments, he was acutely aware of her constant care, of the gentle competence in her hands, of the soft words of encouragement she spoke when pain made him restless. During one particularly difficult hour, when the fever burned hottest and the pain seemed to consume his entire left side, Reid found himself speaking of things he rarely discussed: the war, his early years with Clara, his fears for Lily's future. Katherine listened without judgment, offering neither platitudes nor pity, simply bearing witness to the thoughts that fever had loosened from his carefully guarded mind. "I promised Clara I would keep Lily safe," he murmured as dawn approached, the fever finally beginning to ease slightly. "But sometimes I fear I'm failing her in other ways. A girl needs a mother's guidance." "You've given Lily security and love," Katherine replied softly. "Those are the foundations upon which all else is built." "Not enough," Reid insisted, his fever-bright eyes meeting hers. "She deserves more than a father who only knows cattle and horses, who can't teach her to be a proper lady." Katherine smiled gently. Perhaps that's why she has a schoolteacher who admires her father's dedication more than he knows. The simple statement, delivered with quiet sincerity, pierced through Reid's defenses more effectively than any passionate declaration could have. He found himself unable to respond, emotions he had kept carefully contained for years threatening to overwhelm him. Katherine seemed to understand. She simply adjusted his blanket and rose to tend the fire, giving him space to compose himself. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the world into a hushed landscape of white. By mid-morning, Reid's fever had broken. He woke to find Katherine dozing in a chair she had pulled beside the cot, her head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, the shotgun still within easy reach. The sight stirred something profound within him. This educated, refined woman had spent the night guarding him, tending his wounds, fighting alongside him against fever and pain. He shifted slightly and her eyes immediately opened, alert despite her obvious fatigue. "How are you feeling?" she asked, leaning forward to check his forehead with the back of her hand. "Better," Reid replied honestly. "Fever's down. Shoulder still hurts like the devil, but my head's clearer." Relief washed over her face. "Good, you had me worried for a while there." "Sorry to be such trouble," he said, attempting a smile. "Not trouble," she corrected, "just concerning." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of snow against the cabin's single window. Reid found himself studying Katherine's face, the delicate curve of her jaw, the intelligence in her hazel eyes, the slight furrow between her brows that spoke of concern not yet fully alleviated. "You should rest properly," he suggested. "Take the cot for a while, I can manage in the chair." Katherine shook her head firmly. "You're not moving anywhere with that shoulder. Besides, help should arrive soon." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses reached them. Katherine immediately tensed, moving to the window with the shotgun ready. After a careful look, her shoulders relaxed. "6 men," she reported, "leading a wagon. One looks like Morgan." Relief flooded through Reid, though it was tinged with a surprising reluctance. Once help arrived, the strange intimacy of their time in this cabin would end. They would return to being Mr. Hastings and Miss Zimmer, rancher and schoolteacher, connected by propriety rather than shared danger and vulnerability. The riders approached cautiously, Morgan calling out before they reached the cabin door. Katherine opened it to find the old line rider accompanied by 5 armed cowboys bearing the Circle T brand on their coats. "Made it through the snow," Morgan said by way of greeting. "How's the patient?" "Fever broke this morning," Katherine reported. "He's stronger, but the journey will be difficult." The foreman of the group, a stocky man with a thick mustache, stepped forward. "Name's Peterson, ma'am. Boss sent us with the wagon and extra men in case of trouble. We'll get you both safely to the main ranch." The cowboys efficiently prepared for departure, 2 of them constructing a makeshift stretcher to transfer Reid to the wagon, which had been lined with blankets and hay for comfort. Despite Reid's protests that he could walk, Katherine and Morgan insisted on the stretcher, unwilling to risk reopening his wound. "The ranch is sending a rider to Helena," Peterson informed them as the men carried Reid carefully to the wagon. "To inform the conference organizers of the situation and arrange proper accommodations for when you're able to travel there." "That's very thoughtful," Katherine said, gathering their few belongings from the cabin. "Please convey my gratitude to your employer." "Circle T takes care of its neighbors," Peterson replied simply, "even temporary ones." The journey to the main ranch was slow and painful for Reid, despite the cowboys' best efforts to minimize jolting on the rough trail. Katherine rode beside the wagon, frequently checking on him and insisting on regular stops to examine his wound and give him water. By late afternoon, they reached the Circle T ranch, a substantial operation with a large main house, bunkhouse, barn, and numerous outbuildings. They were met in the yard by the ranch owner himself, Harold Thompson, a barrel-chested man in his 50s with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command. "Hastings," he greeted Reid as the cowboys carefully moved him from the wagon. "Heard you ran into trouble on my range. Consider yourself my guest until you're back on your feet." "Appreciate the hospitality," Reid managed, grimacing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "And you must be Miss Zimmer," Thompson continued, turning to Katherine with unexpected gentility. "My wife is eager to meet you. She doesn't get much female company out here." Inside the main house, they found comfort beyond what the line cabin could provide. Real beds, a proper kitchen, and Thompson's wife, Helena, who turned out to be a former nurse with considerable medical experience. She immediately took charge of Reid's care, insisting he be installed in their best guest room and examining his wound with professional efficiency. "Good stitching," she pronounced after inspection. "Morgan hasn't lost his touch." You're fortunate the bullet passed through cleanly. With proper rest, you should recover fully. How long? Reid asked, concerned about his extended absence from the ranch and from Lily. At least a week before you should travel, Helena replied firmly, and even then only by easy stages. A week, the prospect of such delay would normally have filled Reid with restless frustration. Instead, he found himself strangely resigned to it, perhaps even grateful for the forced pause in his carefully ordered existence. Katherine was given the adjoining guest room, with a connecting door that Helena left conspicuously ajar, in case Mr. Hastings needs assistance during the night. If she harbored any thoughts about the propriety of their traveling arrangement or their time alone in the line cabin, she kept them to herself, treating them both with warm hospitality. That evening, after Reid had rested and been helped to a light dinner, Katherine came to sit with him. She had been given a dress to wear from Helena's wardrobe, a simple blue calico that suited her remarkably well, and had arranged her hair in a loose braid that fell over one shoulder. "Mr. Thompson has sent a rider to Whitehorn," she informed him, settling into a chair beside his bed, "to let your people know what happened and that you're safe." "Thank you," Reid said, genuinely relieved. "Lily will worry otherwise. The messenger will also stop at the school to collect the documentation I need for the conference," Katherine continued. "Mrs. Thompson has graciously offered to accompany me to Helena once it arrives, so you needn't worry about delaying my business there." Reid felt an unexpected pang of disappointment at the thought of Katherine continuing to Helena without him. "That's considerate of her." Katherine studied his face carefully. "Unless you would prefer I remain here until you're well enough to travel." The question hung between them, laden with implications neither had yet acknowledged directly. Reid knew the proper response: to insist she continue her journey, to release her from any obligation to him, to maintain the careful distance that propriety and his own defenses demanded. Instead, he found himself saying, "I would prefer that, yes, if it wouldn't inconvenience your plans too severely." A soft smile touched Katherine's lips. "Then I shall stay." The conference lasts 2 weeks, after all. Even with a delayed arrival, I should be able to accomplish what's needed. They talked for another hour, the conversation flowing easily between them as it had in the line cabin, but without the urgency of danger to drive it. Katherine spoke of her plans for the school, her hopes for expanding both the curriculum and the facilities if the territorial funding came through. Reid shared stories of Lily's latest adventures, of the ranch's development, of his vision for its future. When Helena came to check Reid's bandages and suggest he rest, Katherine rose to leave. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. "I'm glad you're recovering well," she said softly. The thought of having to tell Lily that her father— she didn't complete the sentence, but the emotion in her eyes spoke volumes. "Thank you," Reid replied equally softly. "For everything." After she had gone, Reid lay in the unfamiliar but comfortable bed, contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. What had begun as a simple escort duty had become something far more complicated: an ambush, a bullet wound, and hours of vulnerability in a snowbound cabin with a woman who was rapidly becoming more important to him than he had ever intended to allow. The walls he had built around his heart after Clara's death had served him well for 6 years, keeping pain at bay, allowing him to focus solely on Lily and the ranch. Now those walls were developing cracks, and Reid wasn't certain whether he should repair them urgently or allow them to crumble entirely. The next week passed in a pattern that quickly became familiar and surprisingly comfortable. During the days, Reid rested, his strength gradually returning as Helena's capable nursing and Katherine's constant company aided his recovery. The bullet wound began to heal cleanly, though the area remained tender and his left arm had limited mobility that would take time to restore fully. Katherine divided her time between sitting with Reid, assisting Helena with household tasks, and preparing her presentation for the education conference. Each evening, she would read aloud from books in the Thompson library, her clear voice bringing to life everything from Shakespeare to Mark Twain as Reid listened, finding more enjoyment in literature than he had since Clara's death. Harold Thompson proved to be an excellent host, visiting Reid daily to discuss ranching matters and local news. On the 3rd day, he brought word that a patrol of territorial marshals had engaged Harlow's gang near the Idaho border. 2 of his men killed, but Harlow himself escaped, Thompson reported, sitting in the chair beside Reid's bed. They're still hunting him, but he's headed west, away from here. That's something at least, Reid acknowledged, though he wouldn't feel entirely easy until Harlow was captured or confirmed dead. Any word on why they targeted us specifically? Thompson nodded grimly. Marshall questioned one of the wounded gang members. Seems they had information about the school building fund Miss Zimmer was carrying. Inside information from someone in Whitehorn. The implication was troubling. Someone in town is working with Harlow. Appears so. Marshall didn't get a name before the man died, but they're investigating. Thompson stroked his mustache thoughtfully. When you return to Whitehorn, you'd be wise to watch your back until this is resolved. The warning weighed on Reid's mind as he continued his recovery. The idea that someone in their community, someone who might interact with Lily or Katherine regularly, could be connected to outlaws was deeply disturbing. It added urgency to his healing. He needed to return to Whitehorn to ensure both Lily's safety and Katherine's. On the 5th day, the rider returned from Whitehorn with letters for both Reid and Katherine. Reid's was from Thomas Cooper, reporting that all was well at the ranch and that Lily was being well cared for, though missing her father terribly. The letter included a note from Lily herself, complete with a drawing of what appeared to be Reid on a horse, with a stick figure labeled Miss Zimmer beside him. Katherine's packet contained the documents she needed for the conference, along with a letter from her assistant teacher assuring her that the school was functioning smoothly in her absence. Most importantly, it included the bank draft for the school building fund, a substantial sum that confirmed why Harlow had targeted them so deliberately. Perhaps I should travel to Helena alone after all, Katherine suggested that evening as they discussed the situation. Now that we know for certain they were after the bank draft, it would be safer to separate it from you during your recovery. Absolutely not, Reid replied with unexpected vehemence. Harlow is still at large, and there's apparently someone in Whitehorn who informed him of your mission. Until we know who that is, you're not traveling alone. Katherine raised an eyebrow at his tone. I managed quite well on my own before you were shot, if you recall. And I recall that you chose to stay with me rather than continue alone, Reid countered. The situation hasn't become less dangerous since then. They stared at each other for a moment, stubborn wills clashing, before Katherine's expression softened slightly. Very well, but we should depart as soon as you're strong enough. The conference begins in 4 days. Reid nodded, relieved she had relented. Helena says I can travel by the day after tomorrow if we take it slowly. We can reach Helena in time for the main sessions. 2 days later, Reid was deemed sufficiently recovered to undertake the journey. His strength had returned enough that he could mount and ride without assistance, though his left arm remained in a sling to minimize movement of his healing shoulder. Helena provided them with fresh bandages and medicinal supplies, while Harold insisted on sending 2 of his cowboys as additional escorts all the way to Helena. No arguments, Thompson said when Reid began to protest. I've got men to spare, and it's the neighborly thing to do. Besides, Helena would have my hide if anything happened to either of you after she put so much effort into patching you up. They departed mid-morning, with profuse thanks to the Thompsons for their hospitality. The weather had cleared during Reid's recovery, leaving the trails passable though still snowy in shaded areas. They traveled at a moderate pace, the 2 Circle T cowboys riding ahead and behind as lookouts. By late afternoon, they had covered about half the distance to Helena. Reid's shoulder ached from the movement, but he was determined not to show weakness or delay their progress. Katherine rode beside him, occasionally glancing at him with concern that she tried to conceal when she noticed his attention. You're in pain, she observed finally as they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream. Don't bother denying it. I can see it in the way you hold yourself. Reid gave her a rueful smile. Not much gets past you, does it? Very little, she agreed, reaching into her saddlebag for the small bottle of laudanum Helena had provided. A small dose would help, without clouding your mind significantly. Reid shook his head. I'll manage, save it for when it's truly needed. Katherine studied him for a moment, then returned the bottle to her bag without further argument. Instead, she moved closer and adjusted the sling supporting his arm, her touch gentle but sure. At least let me check the bandage when we stop for the night. Yes, ma'am, Reid replied with mock solemnity, earning a small laugh from her. The sound of her laughter affected him more than he cared to admit, a warm current that seemed to ease the pain in his shoulder and lighten something in his chest that had been heavy for far too long. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Katherine Zimmer was becoming important to him in ways that went far beyond the protective duty he had originally undertaken. They reached the outskirts of Helena as dusk was falling, the town's lights twinkling welcomingly in the valley below them. Unlike Whitehorn, which remained a frontier settlement despite its growth, Helena had developed into a substantial city with brick buildings, proper streets, and all the trappings of Eastern civilization transported west. The hotel where the education conference was being held stood prominently on Last Chance Gulch, the city's main thoroughfare. It was an impressive three-story structure with a columned entrance and large windows illuminated from within. As they approached, Reid could see well-dressed men and women entering, presumably for an evening reception related to the conference. Katherine straightened in her saddle at the sight, smoothing her travel-worn clothes self-consciously. "I had hoped to arrive with more dignity," she murmured, more to herself than to Reid. "You look fine," Reid assured her, then amended when she gave him a skeptical look. "Well, perhaps a bit trail-worn. But considering what we've been through, I'd say dignified applies rather well." Their arrival at the hotel created a small stir, particularly when the desk clerk recognized Katherine's name. "Miss Zimmer, we received word of your delay. The conference committee has been most concerned. As you can see, I've arrived safely, if not entirely on schedule," Katherine replied with the composed dignity Reid had come to admire. "I trust my reservation is still valid." "Of course, ma'am. And for your companions." Reid stepped forward. "My men will find accommodations elsewhere." He nodded to the Circle T cowboys, who understood they were dismissed to find lodging more suited to their station and budget. "I'll need a room as well." The clerk checked his register. "We're quite full with the conference, but I believe we have one room available on the third floor." "That will do," Reid nodded, reaching for his wallet. "Mr. Hastings is recovering from an injury sustained while ensuring my safe passage," Katherine interjected smoothly. "Perhaps something on a lower floor would be more suitable." The clerk looked flustered. "I'm afraid not, Miss Zimmer. Unless," he hesitated, then lowered his voice. "The room adjacent to yours is occupied by a Miss Pratt from the Boston Education Society, but she sent word this afternoon that she's been delayed by at least 2 days due to railway difficulties." Katherine's eyes lit with recognition. "Harriet Pratt, we were acquainted in Boston. I'm certain she wouldn't mind if Mr. Hastings used her room until she arrives." The clerk still looked uncertain, but Katherine's confident manner prevailed. Within minutes, arrangements had been made, and a porter was escorting them to their rooms on the second floor. "That was neatly handled," Reid observed once they were alone in the corridor. "Though I'm not entirely comfortable taking this Miss Pratt's room." "Harriet will understand the circumstances," Katherine assured him. "Besides, you need proper rest after today's journey, not 3 flights of stairs every time you come and go." Her concern touched him, though he tried not to show it. "Well, I suppose I'll repay the imposition by vacating promptly when she arrives." Katherine's room was comfortably appointed with a 4-poster bed, writing desk, armchair, and private washroom, luxurious by frontier standards. Reid's borrowed accommodation next door was similarly furnished, though in more masculine tones. Both rooms faced the street, with large windows offering views of the bustling city below. After the porter had departed, Katherine hesitated in the doorway between their rooms, which had been left open during the tour of the accommodations. "You should rest," she suggested. "The reception downstairs can wait until tomorrow for introductions." Reid nodded, suddenly aware of the fatigue that had been building throughout the day's ride. "What about you?" "They're expecting you." "They've waited this long," Katherine replied with a small smile. "One more night won't matter. Besides, I'm hardly presentable after days of travel." "You look," Reid began, then stopped himself, aware he was venturing into dangerous territory. "Rest sounds wise," he finished lamely. Katherine's eyes held his for a moment, something unspoken passing between them, then she nodded slightly. "Good night, Reid. I'll check on you in the morning." "Good night, Katherine." After she had closed the connecting door, Reid sat heavily on the edge of the bed, his shoulder throbbing but his mind more occupied with the woman in the next room than with his physical discomfort. The journey had transformed their relationship in ways he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure he was ready to confront. In Whitehorn, Katherine had been Miss Zimmer, the schoolteacher, someone he respected professionally, but kept at the same careful distance he maintained with everyone except Lily. Now, after sharing dangers, after her care during his fever, after conversations that had ranged from literature to personal history to their deepest hopes for the future, she had become simply Katherine, a woman whose presence had somehow become necessary to his peace of mind. The realization was unsettling. Reid had built his life around self-sufficiency, around needing no one except his daughter. The walls around his heart had been his protection against the kind of devastating loss he had experienced with Clara. Now those walls were crumbling, and he wasn't certain whether to rebuild them urgently or allow them to fall completely. Morning brought clarity, as it often did. Reid woke to sunlight streaming through the hotel window and the sounds of Helena coming to life below, wagon wheels on cobblestones, merchants calling their wares, the general bustle of a city larger and more developed than Whitehorn. His shoulder felt better after a night in a proper bed, the pain reduced to a dull ache rather than the sharp throb of the previous day. A gentle knock at the connecting door preceded Katherine's appearance. She was already dressed for the day in a deep blue dress that must have been packed in her saddlebags, but somehow had emerged relatively unwrinkled. Her hair was arranged in a simple but elegant style, and she carried a tray with coffee and what appeared to be freshly baked rolls. "Good morning," she greeted him with a smile that did strange things to Reid's heartbeat. "I thought you might appreciate breakfast without navigating the dining room." "Thoughtful of you," Reid replied, suddenly acutely aware that he was still in bed, though thankfully covered to the chest with blankets. "I'll just—" "Of course," Katherine said quickly, setting the tray on the desk. "I'll give you privacy to dress. The conference registration begins at 9. I thought perhaps you might accompany me if you're feeling strong enough." The invitation surprised him. "I'm hardly qualified to participate in an education conference." "As my escort, not a participant," Katherine clarified, "unless you had other plans for the day." Reid didn't, in fact, have any particular agenda beyond ensuring Katherine's safety. "I'd be honored," he heard himself say, "though I should warn you, I'll be the most undereducated man in the room." Katherine's smile widened slightly. "Somehow I doubt that." 9 o'clock, then." After she had gone, Reid rose and dressed carefully, mindful of his injured shoulder. The hotel had arranged for hot water to be delivered, allowing him to shave and make himself as presentable as possible given his limited wardrobe. His trail clothes, while serviceable, were hardly appropriate for an education conference, but they were all he had available. At precisely 9, he knocked on Katherine's door. She opened it immediately, as if she had been waiting just on the other side. The sight of her momentarily stole Reid's breath. She had added a lace collar to her blue dress and arranged her chestnut hair in a more elaborate style than earlier, with soft curls framing her face. She looked every inch the accomplished educator, ready to impress her peers. "You look," Reid searched for an appropriate compliment, "very professional." A hint of amusement touched her eyes. "Thank you." "That is precisely the impression I hope to convey." She glanced at his attire. "And you look very frontier authentic." Reid couldn't help but laugh at her diplomatic assessment of his worn trail clothes. "I'm sure I'll add a touch of local color to the proceedings." They made their way downstairs to the hotel's main conference room, where tables had been set up for registration and displays of educational materials. The space was already busy with men and women in formal attire, their conversations creating a buzz of intellectual energy that Reid found both intimidating and fascinating. Katherine moved through the crowd with confidence, greeting colleagues she had corresponded with but never met in person, introducing Reid simply as Mr. Hastings, who has kindly escorted me from Whitehorn. If anyone wondered about their relationship beyond that professional description, they kept such thoughts to themselves. Reid found a relatively unobtrusive position near a window, content to observe Katherine in her element. She spoke animatedly with other educators about curriculum developments, teaching methodologies, and the challenges of frontier education. Her intelligence and passion were evident, drawing others into her orbit naturally. Several times she glanced his way, a small smile of acknowledgement passing between them across the room. "She's quite remarkable, isn't she?" a voice observed beside Reid. He turned to find an older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes studying him with interest. The man extended his hand. Professor James Harrington, Territorial Superintendent of Education. Reid shook the offered hand. Reid Hastings, sir, you know Miss Zimmer. By reputation and correspondence, Harrington replied. Her reports from Whitehorn have been most impressive. Building a quality educational program in a frontier community is no small achievement. Pride warmed Reid's chest, though he had no personal claim to Katherine's accomplishments. The town is fortunate to have her. As is your daughter, I understand, Harrington said, surprising Reid with his knowledge of their connection. Miss Zimmer mentioned her in her letters, a particularly promising student, she said. Lily has thrived under her teaching, Reid acknowledged. She's developed interests I never would have thought to encourage. Harrington nodded approvingly. Education is transformative, Mr. Hastings. It opens doors our children never knew existed. He glanced toward Katherine, who was now in conversation with several women near a display of textbooks. Miss Zimmer understands that better than most. Her proposal for the new Whitehorn school is one of the most compelling I've reviewed. She's determined to see it built, Reid said, recalling Katherine's insistence on making this journey despite the dangers. So I gathered from the rather dramatic circumstances of your arrival. At Reid's questioning look, Harrington explained, word travels quickly in conference circles. An ambush, a bullet wound, a rescue in a snowstorm, quite the adventure. Reid shifted uncomfortably, not having realized their ordeal had become common knowledge. Miss Zimmer showed remarkable courage throughout. As did you by all accounts, Harrington replied. He studied Reid thoughtfully. You care for her. It wasn't a question, and Reid didn't bother denying it. She's an exceptional woman. Indeed she is, Harrington's eyes held a knowing look. Well, I should continue my rounds. A pleasure meeting you, Mr. Hastings. I look forward to hearing Miss Zimmer's presentation tomorrow. As Harrington moved away, Reid found Katherine approaching, her expression bright with excitement. The committee wants to review my proposal this afternoon, she told him, her voice pitched low for his ears alone. If they approve it, the funding could be secured before we even return to Whitehorn. That's wonderful news, Reid replied, genuinely pleased for her. I just met Superintendent Harrington. He seems impressed with your work. Katherine's eyes widened slightly. Professor Harrington is here. His approval would virtually guarantee the funding. She glanced around the room. I should speak with him before the committee meeting. He's over by the refreshment table, Reid indicated. The distinguished gentleman with silver hair. I know him by description, Katherine nodded. Would you mind terribly if I... Go, Reid encouraged. I'll be fine on my own for a while. As Katherine moved purposefully toward Harrington, Reid found himself watching her with a mixture of admiration and something deeper, something he was becoming less able to deny with each passing day. Seeing her in this professional context, confident and respected among her peers, added yet another dimension to his understanding of her character. The morning passed quickly. Reid alternated between observing Katherine's interactions and exploring the educational displays that filled the conference room. Though he had limited formal education himself, he found the materials fascinating. New methods for teaching reading, mathematical instruments designed to make abstract concepts concrete, maps that showed the rapidly changing American landscape as territories became states. When the lunch hour arrived, Katherine rejoined him, her eyes bright with intellectual stimulation. Are you terribly bored? She asked with genuine concern. This must seem painfully academic compared to ranch life. Not at all, Reid assured her. I'm finding it quite interesting, though I admit some of the conversations I've overheard might as well be in Greek for all I understand them. Katherine laughed lightly. Education has its own language, I'm afraid. But the core of it is simple enough, finding the best ways to help children learn and grow. A worthy pursuit, Reid agreed. One you excel at from what I've observed with Lily and what Superintendent Harrington told me. A becoming flush colored Katherine's cheeks at the compliment. Professor Harrington has been most supportive of our little school. His endorsement will carry significant weight with the committee. They took lunch in the hotel dining room, joined by several other educators who seemed eager to hear more about Katherine's experiences in Whitehorn. Reid was content to listen, as she described the challenges and rewards of frontier teaching, impressed by her ability to advocate for her students' needs without romanticizing or exaggerating the realities of territorial life. After lunch, Katherine excused herself to prepare for her committee presentation. "This could take several hours," she told Reid apologetically. "Please don't feel obligated to wait." "I'll find ways to occupy myself," he assured her. "Perhaps explore Helena a bit. I have some supplies to purchase before our return journey." Katherine hesitated, then asked, "Will you join me for dinner this evening?" "To celebrate if the proposal is approved, or console me if it isn't." The invitation sent a warm current through Reid's chest. "I'd be honored. Good luck with your presentation, though I doubt you'll need it." Left to his own devices, Reid ventured out into Helena. The city was substantially larger and more developed than Whitehorn, with brick buildings lining proper streets, gaslight fixtures being installed, and businesses of all descriptions operating in close proximity. He visited a mercantile to purchase supplies they would need for the return journey, then a gunsmith to replace the ammunition he had used during their ambush. As he moved through the busy streets, Reid found his thoughts repeatedly returning to Katherine. The conference had revealed yet another facet of her character, the professional educator, respected by her peers, passionate about her calling. It complemented the other aspects of her he had come to admire. Her courage during their ordeal, her compassion during his fever, her intelligence during their many conversations, her gentleness with Lily. The cumulative effect was becoming impossible to ignore. Reid Hastings, who had sworn off emotional attachments after Clara's death, who had built walls around his heart to protect against further loss, was falling in love with Katherine Zimmer. The realization stopped him in his tracks on a busy street corner, earning irritated looks from pedestrians forced to navigate around him. Love, the word he had banished from his vocabulary, the emotion he had convinced himself was a luxury he could not afford, the vulnerability he had protected against for 6 long years. Yet there it was, undeniable as the Montana sun overhead. Somewhere between Whitehorn and Helena, between duty and choice, between fear and courage, Reid had allowed Katherine past his defenses. The question now was what to do about it. By the time he returned to the hotel late that afternoon, Reid had reached no definitive conclusion. Love might be undeniable, but acting on it remained a choice, one with profound implications for himself, for Lily, and for Katherine. He needed time to consider those implications carefully before saying or doing anything that couldn't be undone. He was crossing the hotel lobby when a familiar voice called his name. Turning, he saw Sheriff Morgan from Whitehorn approaching, still wearing his trail clothes and looking as though he had ridden hard to reach Helena. "Sheriff," Reid greeted him with surprise and growing concern. "What brings you to Helena?" Morgan glanced around the crowded lobby before responding. "News about Harlow and that inside man we suspected. Need to speak with you and Miss Zimmer privately." The serious expression on the sheriff's face set alarm bells ringing in Reid's mind. "She's in a committee meeting, should be finished soon. We can use my room to talk." Morgan nodded grimly. "Best we do, this isn't for public ears." Upstairs, Reid offered the sheriff the room's only armchair while he took a position leaning against the desk, his concern mounting with each passing moment. "What's happened?" Morgan removed his hat and ran a hand through his graying hair. "Harlow was captured yesterday, about 30 miles west of here, put up a fight, got himself killed in the process." Relief coursed through Reid. "That's good news, isn't it?" Partially, Morgan agreed. But before he died, he confirmed our suspicions about an inside man in Whitehorn, someone who told him about Miss Zimmer's trip and the school funds she would be carrying. Reid straightened. "Did he give a name?" Morgan nodded slowly. "Robert Caldwell." The name hit Reid like a physical blow. Caldwell, the bank manager. "The same. He's been feeding information to Harlow's gang for months, identifying potential targets with large cash movements." Reid tried to process this revelation. Robert Caldwell was a respected member of the Whitehorn community, a founding member of the town council, a regular churchgoer, and a man who had always presented himself as the very model of propriety and integrity. "Have you arrested him?" Reid asked. Morgan's expression darkened. "That's the problem. When I went to serve the warrant, he was gone, cleared out his office and home, disappeared completely." Took a substantial amount of bank funds with him, too. How does this affect us now, with Harlow dead? Caldwell knows things, Morgan interrupted, including that you and Miss Zimmer survived the ambush and that she's still carrying those school funds. My concern is he might try to finish what Harlow started, either himself or by hiring others. The implications were immediately clear to Reid. Katherine remained in danger, perhaps even more so now that Caldwell was desperate and on the run. We need to tell her as soon as her meeting ends. There's more, Morgan said heavily. Before he left town, Caldwell was asking questions about your ranch, specific questions about when your hands would be moving cattle to the north pasture. Cold fear gripped Reid's heart. Lily. She's safe, Morgan assured him quickly. I sent deputies to bring her and the Coopers into town before I left for Helena. They're staying at my house under guard until this is resolved. Relief warred with renewed anger in Reid's chest. That Caldwell would target his daughter, even indirectly, transformed this from a matter of duty to something deeply personal. We need to find him. Territorial marshals are already searching, Morgan replied. But Helena would be a logical destination if he's trying to leave Montana altogether. The stagecoach lines, the railroad, lots of ways to disappear from here. Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Reid moved cautiously to answer it, his hand near his holster, but it was only a hotel porter with a message. For Mr. Hastings from Miss Zimmer. Reid accepted the folded note and read it quickly. Her committee meeting is finished. She's returning to her room to freshen up before dinner. Morgan stood, perfect timing. Best we tell her together. They moved to the connecting door between the rooms. Reid knocked and called, Katherine, Sheriff Morgan is here with important news. No response came from the other side. Reid knocked again, louder this time. Katherine. When silence continued to be the only answer, a sense of foreboding crept up Reid's spine. He tried the handle and found it unlocked. Pushing the door open carefully, he scanned the room beyond. Katherine's room was empty, the bed neatly made, her traveling bag on the luggage stand, but no sign of Katherine herself. Nothing appeared disturbed or out of place, except for a folded paper on the writing desk that hadn't been there earlier. Reid crossed to the desk and picked up the paper. As he unfolded it, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The message was brief and chilling. Mr. Hastings, I have Miss Zimmer and the bank draft. If you want to see her alive again, come alone to the abandoned silver mill 2 miles west of town at sundown. Tell no one or she dies. R.C. Reid passed the note to Morgan, his mind already racing through possibilities, calculating distances, formulating plans. Caldwell, Morgan confirmed grimly after reading it. Must have been watching the hotel, saw her return alone. How would he know about our connecting rooms? Reid wondered aloud, then answered his own question. The hotel staff. He could have bribed someone for information. Morgan nodded. Likely, the question now is what to do about it. I'm going, Reid said immediately, alone as instructed. That's exactly what he wants, Morgan argued. It's almost certainly a trap. Of course it is, Reid agreed, but I don't see that we have much choice. He has Katherine. Morgan considered for a moment. The abandoned silver mill is the old Blackwater operation, closed down 3 years ago when the vein ran out. It's isolated, lots of places for ambush. You know it, Reid asked, hope rising slightly. Been there a few times, Morgan confirmed. There's a back approach through a dry creek bed, not easily visible from the main buildings. A plan began to form in Reid's mind. If I approach openly from the main road while you come in from behind. Might work, Morgan nodded, but it's risky. Caldwell's desperate and desperate men are unpredictable. Reid checked his watch. We have about 2 hours until sundown, enough time to prepare and position ourselves. Morgan hesitated, then agreed reluctantly. I'll need to inform the local sheriff. No jurisdiction here, technically. Do it discreetly, Reid cautioned. If Caldwell has any accomplices watching, they could alert him. As Morgan left to make arrangements, Reid gathered his thoughts and checked his weapons. His shoulder still ached, but adrenaline and determination were pushing the pain into the background. Katherine's life depended on his actions now, and he would not fail her. The image of her face, intelligent, kind, determined, rose in his mind. The woman who had tended his fever, who had shown such courage during their ambush, who spoke of education with passionate conviction, who had somehow slipped past his carefully constructed defenses to claim a place in his heart. He would get her back safely, whatever the cost. Sundown found Reid approaching the abandoned silver mill from the main road, as instructed. The complex consisted of several weathered wooden buildings, a tall processing tower, and the dark mouth of the mine shaft itself, all situated in a small valley surrounded by pine-covered hills. The fading light cast long shadows across the scene, creating numerous hiding places for anyone wishing to remain concealed. Reid rode openly, making no attempt to disguise his approach. His left arm remained in a sling, but his right hand stayed close to his holster. According to their hastily formed plan, Sheriff Morgan should now be making his way through the dry creek bed toward the rear of the property, accompanied by 2 deputies from the Helena Sheriff's Office. As he neared the main building, what had once been the mill's office, Reid called out loudly, "Caldwell, I'm here alone as you requested." For a moment, only silence answered him. Then the office door creaked open, and Robert Caldwell emerged, holding Katherine before him as a shield. She appeared unharmed but frightened, her hands bound in front of her, Caldwell's revolver pressed against her side. "Stop right there, Hastings," Caldwell commanded. "Dismount slowly and keep your hands where I can see them." Reid complied carefully, mindful of his injured shoulder as he slid from the saddle. "I came alone, Caldwell." "Now let her go." Caldwell gave a short, humorless laugh. "Not quite yet. Hands up and walk forward slowly." As Reid approached, he could see Caldwell more clearly in the fading light. The bank manager's usually immaculate appearance had deteriorated. His suit was wrinkled, his face unshaven, his eyes holding the desperate look of a man who had abandoned all pretense of civilization. "You've made quite a mess, Robert," Reid observed conversationally, trying to keep Caldwell's attention on him while watching for any sign of Morgan's approach. "Bank fraud, conspiracy with outlaws, kidnapping, not the legacy most men hope to leave." "Save your judgments," Caldwell snapped. "Some of us weren't born to ranching wealth like you, Hastings. Some of us have to create our own opportunities. By stealing from your neighbors, by putting innocent lives at risk." Reid took another step forward, close enough now to see the fear in Katherine's eyes, though she remained remarkably composed given the circumstances. "Where's the bank draft?" Caldwell demanded, ignoring Reid's questions. "Miss Zimmer doesn't have it on her." "I have it," Reid confirmed, "but you'll get it only after she's safely away from you." Caldwell's grip on Katherine tightened visibly. "You're not in a position to make demands. The draft now or she dies." Reid had to keep him talking, buy time for Morgan to get into position. "Why, Katherine? Why not just ambush me on the road if all you wanted was the money?" An unpleasant smile twisted Caldwell's features. "Because I've seen how you look at her, Hastings. Everyone in Whitehorn has. The mighty Reid Hastings, finally showing interest in a woman after all these years." He pressed the gun barrel more firmly against Katherine's ribs, making her wince. "Makes for effective leverage, doesn't it?" Reid felt cold fury rise within him, but he maintained his outward calm. "Let her go, Caldwell. This is between you and me." "Oh, I don't think so," Caldwell replied. "Miss Zimmer here is my ticket to a new life. The bank draft is just a bonus." He began edging backward toward the office door, dragging Katherine with him. "Here's how this will work. You'll give me the draft, then Miss Zimmer and I will take your horse and leave. Once I'm safely away, I'll release her." "You expect me to believe that?" Reid asked incredulously. "It doesn't matter what you believe," Caldwell retorted. "It's the only offer you're going to get." Reid saw movement behind the mill building, a shadow-shifting position in the growing darkness. Morgan was in place. Now he needed to create a distraction. "The draft is in my saddlebag," Reid said, gesturing toward his horse. "Let me get it for you." "Stay where you are," Caldwell ordered sharply. "Tell me which saddlebag, and I'll have Miss Zimmer retrieve it." Before Reid could respond, Katherine suddenly drove her elbow hard into Caldwell's stomach. The unexpected attack caught him by surprise, causing him to loosen his grip momentarily. Katherine twisted away, dropping to the ground as Reid lunged forward. Caldwell recovered quickly, aiming his revolver at Reid. A shot rang out, but it came from behind the mill, not from Caldwell's weapon. The bank manager cried out in pain as the bullet struck his arm, causing him to drop his gun. In the next instant, Reid tackled him to the ground. "You're under arrest, Caldwell," Sheriff Morgan announced, emerging from the shadows with his smoking revolver still aimed at the fallen bank manager. The Helena deputies quickly joined them, taking custody of Caldwell while Morgan helped Katherine to her feet and cut the ropes binding her wrists. Reid stood shakily, his shoulder throbbing from the exertion of the tackle, but his attention was entirely on Katherine. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, moving to her side. She shook her head, visibly trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "No, he didn't. I'm unharmed." Without thinking, Reid pulled her into a one-armed embrace, his right arm holding her tightly against him. The feel of her safe in his arms released something that had been coiled tight within his chest since finding her note. "I was so afraid," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. Katherine's arms came around his waist, her head resting against his chest. "I knew you would come," she whispered. "I never doubted it for a moment." They stood that way until Morgan gently cleared his throat. "We should get Miss Zimmer back to town," he suggested. "The Helena sheriff will want statements from both of you." Reid reluctantly released Katherine, though he kept his hand at the small of her back as they walked toward the horses. The sun had set completely now, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above the pine-covered hills. The crisis was over, Caldwell was in custody, and Katherine was safe, yet Reid felt as though something fundamental had shifted between them, something that couldn't be undone or ignored. The aftermath of Caldwell's capture kept them occupied late into the evening. Statements had to be given at the Helena Sheriff's Office, telegrams sent to Whitehorn confirming the banker's arrest, and arrangements made for their eventual return journey. Through it all, Reid stayed close to Katherine, unwilling to let her out of his sight after the day's events. It was well past midnight when they finally returned to the hotel. In the quiet hallway outside their rooms, Katherine turned to Reid, fatigue evident in her posture, but her eyes still alert and focused on his face. "Thank you," she said simply. "For coming for me." "I would always come for you," Reid replied, the words carrying more weight than he had intended. Katherine studied him for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then she reached up and gently touched his face, her fingers cool against his cheek. "I believe you would," she said softly. "Good night, Reid." Before he could respond, she had slipped into her room, closing the door quietly behind her. Reid stood there for several heartbeats, the ghost of her touch lingering on his skin before retiring to his own room. Sleep eluded him despite his physical and emotional exhaustion. His mind kept replaying the events of the day, but more than that, it kept returning to the realization he had reached earlier, that he had fallen in love with Katherine Zimmer against all his careful plans and protective instincts. What now? The question circled his thoughts like a persistent melody. Should he speak of his feelings, risk rejection, risk the pain of attachment? Or should he rebuild the walls around his heart, retreat to the safety of emotional isolation once the immediate crisis had passed? The answers didn't come easily, and dawn found Reid still wrestling with them as he dressed and prepared to face the day. The conference would continue for Katherine, though under considerably different circumstances than anticipated. As for Reid, he had no formal obligations, only the self-appointed duty of ensuring her safety, a duty that now felt inadequate to describe his motivations for remaining close to her. A knock at the connecting door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, straightening his shirt as best he could with his injured arm. Katherine entered, looking remarkably composed despite the previous day's ordeal. She wore a green dress that complemented her chestnut hair, which was arranged in a simple but elegant style. Only the slight shadows beneath her eyes hinted at the strain she had endured. "Good morning," she greeted him with a small smile. "How is your shoulder?" "Serviceable," Reid replied, touched by her concern for him after her own harrowing experience. "More importantly, how are you?" "Better than might be expected," she admitted, "though I find myself jumpy at sudden noises, which is rather inconvenient in a busy hotel." Reid nodded, understanding. "That will pass with time." "So I'm told." Katherine moved to the window, looking out at the morning bustle of Helena below. "The committee approved my proposal yesterday before everything else happened. The funding for the new schoolhouse is secured." "That's wonderful news," Reid said sincerely. "All your work, all the risks, they've paid off." Katherine turned back to him, her expression thoughtful. "Was it worth it, though? The danger, your injury, yesterday's events with Caldwell. Sometimes I wonder if my determination to see this through has caused more harm than good. Reid crossed to her, close enough to see the doubt in her hazel eyes. Education is worth fighting for, he said firmly. You taught me that. What you're building in Whitehorn isn't just a school building, it's a future for children like Lily, like all the children who might otherwise never have the opportunities learning provides. A soft smile touched Katherine's lips. For a man who claims to be undereducated, you have remarkable insight, Reid Hastings. I've had an exceptional teacher recently, he replied, holding her gaze. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition, perhaps, of feelings that had been developing throughout their journey but had crystallized in the crucible of yesterday's danger. Reid found himself wanting to reach for her to close the small distance that separated them, but uncertainty held him back. Katherine seemed to sense his hesitation. The conference continues today, she said, stepping back slightly. Several presentations I should attend, networking to be done for the school. Of course, Reid nodded, both relieved and disappointed by the return to practicalities. I'll accompany you if that's acceptable. I would appreciate that, Katherine replied. After yesterday, I find I'm not eager to be alone in crowds just yet. They attended the conference together, moving from session to session as Katherine fulfilled her professional obligations. Reid remained close, watchful but unobtrusive, finding genuine interest in the educational discussions despite their technical nature. Throughout the day, he observed Katherine's interactions with her colleagues, noting how they sought her opinions, how they listened when she spoke, how they treated her with the respect her intelligence and dedication warranted. Pride warmed his chest as he watched her in this element, so different from Whitehorn's frontier setting yet equally her domain. Katherine Zimmer was a remarkable woman in any context, adaptable and accomplished, passionate about her calling yet practical in its application. The more Reid observed, the more certain he became of his feelings, and the more terrified of acting on them. Evening found them dining in the hotel restaurant at a small table near the window, watching as lamplighters moved along the street, igniting the gas fixtures that lined Helena's main thoroughfare. Katherine had changed for dinner into a dress of deep burgundy that caught the candlelight in rich undertones, her hair arranged to frame her face in soft waves. Reid, limited by his traveling wardrobe, had merely cleaned up as best he could, though Katherine had helped him replace his sling with a fresh one that looked less trail-worn. "When do you think we should return to Whitehorn?" Katherine asked as they finished their meal. "The most essential conference sessions conclude tomorrow, though it continues for 3 more days after that." Reid considered. "Sheriff Morgan mentioned he'll be heading back the day after tomorrow. We could travel with him for additional security if you've accomplished what you came for." Katherine nodded thoughtfully. That seems sensible. With the funding secured and the main presentations attended, the remaining sessions are less critical for our purposes. She hesitated, then added, "And I find myself eager to return. To see the children, to begin planning for the new school building, to resume normal life." Normal life, Reid repeated softly. The phrase struck him with unexpected force. What would normal life mean once they returned to Whitehorn? Would they revert to their previous formality, Mr. Hastings and Miss Zimmer, connected only by Lily's education? After everything they had experienced together, such distance seemed impossible, yet he wasn't sure what should replace it. Katherine seemed to read his thoughts. "Things will be different when we return, won't they?" she asked quietly. Reid met her gaze across the candlelit table. "Yes," he acknowledged. "I don't see how they could be the same." "What happened in that line cabin during your fever?" Katherine continued carefully. "The things you said about Clara, about your fears for Lily. Were those just delirium speaking?" Heat rose in Reid's face as fragmented memories of those feverish hours returned to him, confessions made, vulnerabilities exposed, walls temporarily demolished by pain and fear. "No," he admitted after a moment. "Not just delirium." Katherine nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself. "And yesterday, when Caldwell said everyone in Whitehorn has seen how you look at me." Reid's heart hammered against his ribs. This was the moment, the precipice he had been approaching for days, perhaps since Katherine had first entered his cabin with books for Lily months ago. Fear urged him to retreat, to deflect, to maintain the safe emotional distance that had protected him for 6 years. But something stronger than fear propelled him forward. "He wasn't wrong," Reid said simply. though I've tried to hide it even from myself. Catherine's eyes widened slightly, a flush coloring her cheeks. I see. A silence fell between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Reid struggled to find the right words to continue, to explain the turmoil of emotions he had been battling, the fear of loss that had kept him isolated for years, the unexpected joy Catherine's presence had brought into his life, the terrifying prospect of risking his heart again. Before he could formulate his thoughts, a familiar voice interrupted from nearby. Miss Zimmer, I heard about yesterday's dreadful incident. Are you quite recovered? They looked up to find Professor Harrington approaching their table, concern evident in his kind face. Katherine composed herself quickly, slipping back into her professional demeanor with practiced ease. Professor Harrington, good evening. Yes, I'm quite well, thank you. Mr. Hastings and Sheriff Morgan ensured the situation was resolved with minimal harm. So I've been told, Harrington replied, nodding respectfully to Reid. The entire conference is buzzing with the story. Quite the frontier adventure, though one I'm sure you could have done without. Indeed, Katherine agreed with a small smile. Harrington glanced between them, perhaps sensing he had interrupted something significant. I won't keep you from your dinner. I simply wanted to convey my relief at your safety and to confirm that the committee's decision on your proposal stands. The funds will be transferred to the Whitehorn Bank next week. That's wonderful news, Katherine replied warmly. Thank you for your support throughout the process. After Harrington had departed with promises to speak further the next day, Katherine turned back to Reid with an apologetic expression. The interruption was unfortunate timing. Reid nodded, feeling the moment had passed for deeper confessions. We were discussing return plans, he said, retreating to safer ground. If we're to leave with Sheriff Morgan, we should make preparations tomorrow. A flash of disappointment crossed Katherine's face, but she nodded in agreement. Yes, of course. Practical matters first. The remainder of their dinner passed in discussion of travel arrangements and conference sessions Katherine hoped to attend the following day. The intimate atmosphere had dissipated, replaced by the comfortable but more distant companionship they had established earlier in their journey. Reid cursed himself for the missed opportunity, for allowing fear to hold him back when the moment for honesty had presented itself. Later, as they walked upstairs to their rooms, Katherine paused outside her door. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, that things will be different when we return to Whitehorn. Reid nodded, uncertain where she was leading. Before we leave Helena, Katherine continued, her voice steady but her eyes revealing vulnerability, I think we should discuss exactly what that means. For both of us. I agree, Reid said quietly. Tomorrow evening perhaps, after your conference sessions. Katherine smiled slightly. Tomorrow evening then, good night, Reid. Good night, Katherine. As he entered his own room, Reid felt a mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Tomorrow evening would require courage, not the physical bravery he had demonstrated during their ambush or Caldwell's capture, but the emotional courage to be honest about his feelings after years of careful self-protection. The prospect was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. The next day passed in a blur of activity. Katherine attended her final conference sessions while Reid made arrangements for their return journey, securing horses and provisions with Sheriff Morgan's assistance. The weather forecast was favorable, and with Harlow dead and Caldwell in custody, the dangers of the trail seemed significantly reduced. By late afternoon, all practical matters had been addressed, leaving only the personal conversation that loomed ahead. Reid found himself growing increasingly nervous as evening approached. He had faced armed outlaws with less trepidation than he now felt at the prospect of opening his heart to Katherine. A knock at his door startled him from his thoughts. Opening it, he found Katherine standing there, still dressed in the blue gown she had worn for the conference's closing session, but with her hair loosened from its formal arrangement to fall in soft waves around her shoulders. I thought perhaps we might talk now, she suggested, rather than waiting for dinner. There's a small garden behind the hotel that offers some privacy. Reid nodded, grabbing his hat out of habit before following her downstairs and through the hotel's back entrance to a modestly landscaped garden. Despite the November chill, the setting sun cast a golden light over the scene, creating a peaceful atmosphere. A bench beneath a bare-limbed maple tree offered a place to sit, partially screened from the hotel windows by strategically placed evergreen shrubs. They sat side by side, close but not touching, both looking straight ahead at first rather than at each other. The silence stretched between them, neither quite knowing how to begin this conversation that could change everything. Finally, Katherine spoke, her voice gentle but direct. When I first came to Whitehorn, I had a clear purpose: to build a school that would provide real education to frontier children, to honor my father's belief that learning should reach every corner of America. She paused, gathering her thoughts. I didn't expect to find personal happiness. It wasn't part of my plan. Reid nodded, understanding completely. When Clara died, I believed that chapter of my life was finished. I would raise Lily, run the ranch, and that would be enough. Wanting more seemed greedy somehow, or dangerous. Dangerous, Katherine repeated softly. Yes, that's the word, isn't it? Opening oneself to possibility means opening oneself to potential loss. I've been afraid, Reid admitted, the words difficult but necessary. Not of outlaws or rustlers or frontier hardships, those are tangible dangers you can face directly. I've been afraid of feeling again, of caring too deeply for someone who might be taken away, as Clara was. Katherine turned to face him then, her hazel eyes searching his. And now? Reid met her gaze steadily. Now I'm more afraid of never taking the risk, of letting fear dictate my choices, of missing what might be possible because I'm too scared to reach for it. Her lips curved in a small smile. That sounds remarkably like courage, Mr. Hastings. If it is, you taught me that too, Reid replied. Taking a deep breath, he continued, Katherine, these past weeks have changed me. Seeing your courage, your intelligence, your kindness toward Lily, your determination to build something meaningful despite all obstacles, it's awakened something in me I thought was gone forever. He hesitated, then took her hand gently in his. I care for you deeply, more than I believed possible after Clara. And while that terrifies me, the thought of returning to Whitehorn and pretending these feelings don't exist terrifies me more. Katherine's fingers tightened around his. When Caldwell had me yesterday, she said quietly, do you know what I thought about? Not the danger, not the school funding, but you, whether I would see you again. Whether I would have the chance to tell you that I've come to care for you too, more than I ever intended or expected. Joy bloomed in Reid's chest, bright and unexpected. You have. Katherine nodded, her eyes bright with emotion. I came west seeking purpose, not attachment. I thought I had left that possibility behind in Boston. But then I met a stubborn rancher who loves his daughter fiercely, who treats his workers fairly, who respects a woman's intelligence even when he disagrees with her, who faces danger with calm courage, and who, despite his best efforts to hide it, has a gentle heart beneath those carefully constructed walls. Reid found himself speechless, overwhelmed by her words and the emotions they stirred. After a moment, he asked the question that still concerned him. What about your career, your school, a rancher's wife? Can still be a teacher, Katherine interrupted firmly. Many married women teach, especially in frontier communities where qualified educators are scarce. I wouldn't be giving up my calling, just expanding my life to include more than I had planned. The implications of her words, that she had already considered what marriage to him might mean, sent a surge of hope through Reid. And Lily, taking on someone else's child, is a privilege, not a burden, Katherine completed his thought again. Lily is extraordinary, Reid. Loving her would be the easiest part of any future we might build. Reid moved closer, his free hand coming up to gently touch Katherine's face. I never thought I would find this again, he admitted softly. Never thought I would want to. Neither did I, Katherine whispered, leaning slightly into his touch. Yet here we are. The space between them seemed to disappear naturally, as if they had always been meant to find their way to this moment. When their lips met, it was gentle at first, a question asked and answered without words, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into a fervent claiming. Reid's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close as if to reassure himself that she was real, that she was safe, that this wasn't a fevered dream born of blood loss and longing. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, Katherine rested her forehead against his. I suppose this means our return journey will be somewhat less formal than the trip here. Reid chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest. I suspect the entire town will know before we even reach the city limits. Sheriff Morgan isn't known for his discretion when it comes to happy news. Let them talk, Katherine said, tracing the line of his jaw. I find I no longer care what anyone thinks, save for one person. Lily, Reid said, the name sobering him slightly. She loves you, Reid, and she wants you to be happy. She wants a mother, he corrected gently. And she adores you, but bringing a new person into our home, it will be an adjustment. We'll take it one step at a time, Katherine promised, together. The return journey to Whitehorn was, as predicted, vastly different from their departure. They traveled with Sheriff Morgan and a small posse of deputies escorting the prisoner Caldwell, but Reid and Katherine rode close together, their conversation constant and effortless. They spoke of the future, of the new schoolhouse construction starting in the spring, of expanding the ranch house to add a study for Katherine, of how to integrate their lives without losing themselves. The weather held, the November sky remaining a crisp, clear blue as they crossed the mountain passes. There were no ambushes, no hidden dangers, only the vast beauty of the territory that was no longer a backdrop for loneliness, but a setting for a shared life. They arrived in Whitehorn on a Tuesday afternoon. The town was buzzing with news of Caldwell's arrest, and a crowd gathered as the sheriff's wagon rolled down Main Street. But Reid ignored the commotion, his eyes scanning the boardwalk for the one face that mattered most. He found her standing outside the sheriff's office with Mrs. Cooper, clutching a woolen shawl tight around her small shoulders. When she saw them, Lily let out a shriek of joy that pierced the noise of the crowd. "Pa." "Miss Zimmer." Reid swung down from his horse, ignoring the twinge in his healing shoulder as he scooped his daughter into his arms. She buried her face in his neck, smelling of soap and wood smoke, sobbing with relief. "I knew you'd come back," she cried. "I knew it." "Always, sunshine," Reid whispered into her curls. "I'll always come back." He set her down, but kept his arm around her shoulders as Katherine dismounted and approached. Lily looked from her father to her teacher, her eyes widening as she took in the subtle but unmistakable change in their demeanor. The way they stood close to one another, the shared look of intimacy that passed between them. "Miss Zimmer is safe," Reid told his daughter, "and the school money is safe." "That's good," Lily said, but her gaze remained fixed on her father's face. "But is that all?" Reid went down on one knee, bringing himself to eye level with his daughter. He took her small hands in his rough ones. "No, Lily, that's not all." He looked up at Katherine, inviting her into the circle. She knelt beside him, her skirts pooling in the dusting of snow on the boardwalk. "Lily," Reid began, his voice thick with emotion, "you know how much I loved your mother. And you know how much I love you." "Yes, Pa. I didn't think I had room in my heart for anyone else," he admitted. "I thought it was full just being your pa, but—" "Miss Zimmer, Katherine, she taught me that hearts are like this territory. They're bigger than we think, and there's always room to grow if you're brave enough to explore." He squeezed Lily's hands. "I've asked Miss Zimmer if she would consider being more than just your teacher. I've asked her if she would consider being part of our family." Lily was silent for a long moment, her serious blue eyes searching Katherine's face. "You mean live at the ranch, for real, not just when it snows?" "For real," Katherine confirmed, her voice trembling slightly. "If you'll have me, Lily, I would never try to replace your mother. She is part of who you are. But I would very much like to be your Katherine, your family." A slow, radiant smile spread across Lily's face, lighting up the gray afternoon. She released her father's hands and threw her arms around Katherine's neck. "I told him," she exclaimed, pulling back to look at Reid with triumphant delight. "Remember, Pa, that day in the kitchen?" Reid laughed, the sound free and unburdened. "I remember." "I said she's perfect for you, Pa," Lily declared loudly, beaming at the small crowd that had begun to gather around them, sensing a moment far more interesting than the prisoner transport. "And I was right." Katherine laughed, blinking back tears as she hugged the girl tight. "You were very right, Lily." Reid stood, pulling both of them into his embrace. Over Katherine's head, he met the eyes of Thomas Cooper, who was grinning broadly, and Sheriff Morgan, who tipped his hat with a satisfied nod. The lonely years were over. The silence of the ranch house would be filled with voices, with reading lessons, with laughter. There would be hard times ahead, winter storms, cattle prices dropping, the inevitable struggles of frontier life. But as Reid looked at the two women who held his heart, he knew they would face it all together. The wedding took place 3 weeks later, in the small white church at the end of town. It was a simple ceremony, attended by what seemed to be the entire population of the valley. The Thompson family rode in from Circle T, Helena fussing over Reid's shoulder, which had healed nicely, and John Lewis brought his family down from the homestead, his son William shyly presenting Katherine with another book as a wedding gift. Lily stood as maid of honor, wearing a dress of blue velvet that matched her eyes, holding her bouquet with solemn importance. When the minister asked who gave this woman to be married, it was Lily who piped up, "We do." Me and Pa, drawing a ripple of laughter from the congregation. When Reid kissed his bride, the cheers that erupted were deafening. It wasn't just a celebration of a marriage, it was a celebration of hope. In a land that took so much, seeing two people find each other, heal each other, and build something new was a victory for everyone. The reception was held in the new schoolhouse, or rather, the shell of it. The frame had been raised the previous week, paid for by the funds Katherine had fought so hard to protect. It stood open to the sky, a promise of the future, filled now with fiddles and dancing and tables groaning with food. As the sun set, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of rose and violet, Reid and Katherine stepped away from the party for a moment of quiet. They stood near the doorway of the unfinished school, looking out at the town and the mountains beyond. "Happy?" Reid asked, wrapping his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "Deliriously," Katherine sighed, leaning into him, "though I suspect Mrs. Cooper is going to spoil us terribly with her cooking now that she has another woman to conspire with." "Let her," Reid said. "We have a lot of years of bad bachelor cooking to make up for." He turned her in his arms, his expression growing serious. "I meant what I said, Katherine. You saved me. I was, half a man before you came, just surviving." "And you saved me," she replied, touching the lapel of his coat. "I was running from a life I didn't want, trying to be noble and solitary. You gave me a home. You gave me a family." "Speaking of family," Reid nodded toward the dance floor, where Lily was currently standing on Thomas Cooper's boots, dancing while the old cowboy swung her around. "She's happy," Katherine said, her eyes soft. "She has a mother again," Reid said, "and a father who remembers how to smile." He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that held all the promise of the winters and springs to come. The wind blew cold from the mountains, but they didn't feel it. They had their own fire now, one that would burn bright enough to keep the darkness at bay for the rest of their lives. 5 years later, the rocking H ranch had grown. A new wing had been added to the main house, filled with books and light. The herd had doubled, and the reputation of Hastings beef was known as far as Chicago. But the heart of the ranch was the porch, where Reid Hastings sat in the summer twilight, whittling a piece of pine. "Pa, look." A toddler with dark hair and hazel eyes wobbled across the grass, chasing a butterfly. "I see him, Jack. You catch him," Reid encouraged his son. The screen door opened, and Katherine stepped out, carrying a pitcher of lemonade. She looked tired. The school year had just ended, and she had spent the day grading final examinations, but her face was serene. "Lily is helping him," she said, nodding toward the paddock where a 13-year-old Lily was leading a pony, the toddler now abandoning the butterfly to run toward his big sister. "She's good with him," Reid observed, taking the glass Katherine offered. "She's good with everyone," Katherine said, sitting beside him on the swing. "She wants to go to the teaching college in Helena next year. Professor Harrington has already sent a letter of recommendation." Reid felt the familiar pang of a father realizing his child is growing up, but it was softened by pride. "She'll make a fine teacher, like her mother." Katherine smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And she'll come back. She loves this valley too much to leave it forever." "We all do," Reid said. He looked out over his land, the green pastures, the mountains turning purple in the distance, the schoolhouse roof visible in the town below. He thought of the lonely man who had stood in this spot 5 years ago, dreading the winter, dreading the silence. That man was gone, healed by a snowstorm, a book, and a woman who had refused to let him hide. "Perfect," he whispered, echoing the words his daughter had spoken so long ago. "What is?" Katherine asked sleepily. Reid kissed the top of her head, watching his children play in the fading light. "Everything," he said, "absolutely everything."